Chapter 1. Rainy Season. The rainstorm came without warning. The sky, which had just been sprinkled with sunshine, was instantly shrouded by dark clouds. The heavy rain poured down. The slum residents who wanted to come out to exercise immediately hid in their houses in fear of being splashed by the rain. The rain accumulated in the streets and quickly spread in the slums. Some of the low-lying houses were submerged in the rain. The drainage system that hadn't been repaired was useless at this moment. In a moment, the entire slums of the outer wall had become a vast ocean. Mission Orphanage. At the entrance of the residential house, a woman who looked to be in her 30s was leading a dozen children, ranging from 7 to 12 years old. They were hurriedly carrying sandbags that had been made long ago and piling them on the doorsill to block the surging rainwater. "Dean, come and help." It's useless to call him. He is a fool. It's really annoying. The boys were sweating from carrying the sandbags. When they saw a little boy standing quietly in front of the window, not far away, they were a little angry, but they knew it was useless to say anything. They could only grit their teeth and continue to place the sandbags in their hands at the door. The little boy in front of the window looked to be about 7 or 8 years old. He was thin and weak, but his height was similar to that of other children of 11 or 12 years old. The most eye-catching thing about him was his extremely fair skin, even a little sickly pale. Compared with other people's dark and dirty skin that had been exposed to strong light and ultraviolet rays, he was out of place. This made many children envious, but Dean was sighing in his heart. This was the sequela caused by the freezing chamber. Although he had left the freezing chamber for more than 3 months, but his body had not recovered. His whole body was weak. In modern medicine, it was called myasthenia gravis. It was very tiring to just stand there, not to mention carrying sandbags to block the rain. However, such a situation was a blessing in misfortune. After all, when a disaster spread to Huaxia, the Research Institute had just made the first freezer and had not had time to enter the experimental stage. No one knew if there would be any kind of failure. It was already a small miracle that he could sleep in a freezer for 300 years unscathed. But he did not feel happy. He did survive, but his parents and sister, who made the freezer, stayed behind. Facing that terrible disaster, even if they were very, very lucky to survive, now that 300 years have passed, they have long been buried in the dust. In this vast world, he no longer had any relatives. From now on, he would face the world alone. He didn't despair. Although he was sad, his parents had given him 2 lives. He would never allow himself to be dispirited. Not only did he want to live well, he wanted to live a life that he could be proud of. He also wanted his deceased parents and sister to be proud of him. Fortunately, God still protected the human race in the end. When he crawled out of the freezer, he thought that he was the only one left on Earth. It was not until he walked out of the garbage dump where the freezer was buried that he found that the human race was not extinct. It seemed that a few people had survived the disaster, and after 300 years of reproduction and development, they had reached a good scale. Unfortunately, the civilization and technology of 300 years ago had been completely destroyed by the disaster. During this time, he didn't see or hear anything that symbolized the technology of the old era. Humans not only lost the power to conquer the planet, but even the basic life was extremely difficult. While he was lost in his thoughts, the storm outside the window gradually stopped. Seeing that the water level in front of the threshold had stopped rising, everyone in the room was relieved. It was as if they had experienced a long battle. Everyone had a feeling of exhaustion. At this time, the middle-aged woman looked at the sky. She saw that the dark clouds had gradually dissipated, revealing a cloudy sky. Knowing that it would not rain for a while, she immediately said, "Get ready to go to the cafeteria to eat. Put on your wax straw shoes." All the children's eyes lit up when they heard the word eat. Their previous exhaustion was swept away. They went back to their rooms, put on their wax straw shoes, and obediently lined up. "Dean, put on your shoes and get ready to eat." At this time, a voice called out to Dean from the back of the line. It was a 7 or 8-year-old boy. As soon as he finished speaking, he seemed to remember something. He patted his head and stepped forward to pat Dean's shoulder. He gestured with one hand and pointed to the direction of the cafeteria. The other sleeve was empty. Dean remembered him. His name was Barton. He was one of the few children in the orphanage who was kind to him. This was probably related to him. 300 years had changed, and the language had been changed. When he first came to the orphanage, he neither understood what others said nor could speak their language. He could only be silent. Over time, everyone thought that he was a bit silly and maybe there was a problem with his IQ. So naturally, he was classified as a deformed child like Barton. The children in the orphanage were divided into two factions. One was the able-bodied ones who were abandoned by their parents, and the other was the deformed ones who were abandoned by their parents. In this world, even children have long learned to survive together. Dean nodded, indicating that he understood, and then followed Barton to the back of the line. Barton was about to ask Dean to change into the wax shoes, but inadvertently looked down and found that under Dean's trousers, he was already wearing a pair of light green high-heeled shoes. He could not help but be dumbfounded. In this world, plastic had not been invented yet. Shoes made of wax grass had become the most commonly used rain gear. This was a kind of natural mutant grass. It could be seen everywhere. Its leaves were large, and the waxy layer on its surface could effectively block the radiation rain. It had become an essential item for every household. Everyone carefully walked along the narrow stone path in front of the threshold. The accumulated rain only reached their ankles. If they accidentally fell into the water, even the strongest adult would inevitably get seriously ill. When they arrived at the cafeteria, everyone immediately began to grab the seats. The limited seats were immediately swept away by the able-bodied children in the front. Dean, Barton, and other deformed children had long been used to it. They came to the back corner, where there were several piles of stones. This was their dining table. Have you heard? Among the adopters, there are doctors and wall builders. Annie Dye said that we should seize this opportunity and perform well. If I can be adopted by the doctor, I will be very happy. I hope to be adopted by the wall builders. Maybe there is hope to climb the giant wall of Sylvia and see the world outside the giant wall. The food had not been delivered yet. Barton and several other children whispered to each other. These children were either missing an ear or half of their face was covered with small lumps of flesh. None of them looked normal. When Dean heard their words, his eyes flashed, but he did not say anything. Unfortunately, Dean's brain is not good. Otherwise, with Dean's appearance and body, he will definitely be selected by those people. After chatting for a while, Barton suddenly sighed, looked at Dean, and said with some regret. The other children looked at Dean, who did not respond, and shook their heads and sighed. They had already discussed that no matter who was adopted, they should do their best to come back to help the rest of the people. Based on appearance alone, Dean was undoubtedly the most promising to be adopted. But brain problems were more serious than physical problems. For example, the child with half of his face was covered with lumps of flesh. Although it looked scary, his hands and feet were sound, and his IQ was normal. At least he could do hard work and find a job. Well, a group of broken things, but they want to compete with us for the opportunity to adopt. At this time, a thin child in a nearby seat heard the words of Barton and others, and said coldly and contemptuously. His words immediately attracted the attention of other people. For a time, disdainful eyes fell on Dean, Barton, and others. Compared to deformed children, these healthy but abandoned people had a heavier hostility in their hearts. Dean faintly looked at these people and did not say anything. Although he was also a child, he had seen a lot of things, and his heart had a depth that many adults did not have. In the eyes of these people, his current appearance was that of a fool. Look at this fool. He doesn't even understand the scolding. A guy with a broken head? No wonder he was abandoned. Still want to be adopted? Obediently wait for the age of 13 to be thrown into the mind to mine. These children did not hide their disdain and disgust, and they took pleasure in it. At this time, the food was delivered, and the middle-aged woman who brought them here said softly, "Quiet. Don't you want to eat?" Hearing this, these children restrained their arrogance, and their faces were innocent, as if nothing had happened just now. The next day, the silver-gray clouds gradually stretched out, and the sun shone on the slums. In the rainy season, this was a rare sunny day. It happened to be a long-awaited big day for the children of the Mission orphanage, Adoption Day. All the families who had made appointments in advance came to the orphanage on this day to choose the children they were satisfied with. Early in the morning, Dean got up on time. Although there was no alarm clock in this world, his biological clock had never gone wrong. After getting up, he tidied up the bedding and washed his face with simple filtered well water. He picked up another set of white coarse clothes next to the pillow. When he was about to change into it, he suddenly felt a soft ball inside. He touched it and saw that it was a purple handkerchief that had been rolled into a ball. Dean was startled and could not help but think of the little girl who led him to the orphanage in the cold night. Unfortunately, the sky was dark, and he could not see her appearance. In the past 3 months in the orphanage, he naturally knew that the people who could afford this exquisite cloth were absolutely the upper class of the outer wall. The handkerchief still had traces of black stains on his face and could not be washed clean. After a moment of silence, Dean put the handkerchief into his arms, put on his clothes, and rushed to the open space outside the orphanage. Although he only had one parent in his heart, he had to let himself be adopted as soon as possible. If a child was not adopted by the age of 13, the orphanage would give up raising him and send him to the mines controlled by the Mission Coal Chamber of Commerce behind the orphanage. He would become a permanent free labor until he died of exhaustion or old age and would never have a chance to see the light of day again. Like Dean, on this day, all the children in the orphanage were dressed up. They washed themselves clean and put on clothes that they were reluctant to wear for a long time. These clothes were coarse clothes that were distributed when they first entered the orphanage. If your body emitted a bad smell, no one would want to be close to you. This was what Aunt Di warned them. Looking around, in front of the sand soaked by the rain, stood a large group of children, but faintly divided into 2 camps, healthy and deformed. After all the children stood in place, the adults who came to adopt, led by Aunt Di and other caretakers of the orphanage, came to the front of the children and looked at the group of orphans who might become their children. "Hello, Uncle Aunt." Under the guidance of Aunt Di, except for Dean and a few other deformed people who could not speak, all the other children were obediently shouting. Their black eyes were full of innocence, and their faces were full of longing and hope as they looked at the adults. Their fiery gazes made some of the adults sigh and feel sorry for them. Soon, Dean, who was thin but tall in the crowd, became the target of all the adults' attention. His pale as snow skin was too eye-catching, and his temperament was completely different from the children around him. The adults could not tell what was different, but they only felt that this child was very calm, with a kind of noble air. Yes, noble air. This surprised many adults. They did not expect that there would be such an excellent seedling in the orphanage of the slums. Chapter 2. The other children were sensitive to this point. One of the petite little girls, who was 8 or 9 years old, immediately said, "Uncles and aunties, he is Dean. There is something wrong with his brain. He likes to be in a daze, and he can't speak. Please don't be offended." Although she was young, the cruel living environment had made her extremely clever. Her words were very clever. She did not appear to be jealous, but pointed out Dudien's shortcomings and also sold him a good boy. Yes, yes, uncles and aunties, don't lower yourself to his level. Only then did the other children come to their senses and hurriedly chimed in. Barton and several other children who lived in the same room with Dean were surprised to see the little girl who took the lead. It seemed that they did not expect her to speak out. At this moment, when they heard the words of other able-bodied children, they could not help but look ugly. However, they did not dare to speak for Dean, for fear of leaving a bad impression on these adults. Dudi glanced at the little girl indifferently and felt slightly surprised in his heart. In his impression of the past 3 months, he remembered that this little girl was one of the few children with a kind personality among the able-bodied children. Even to deformed children like Barton, she never spoke ill of them. Especially this little girl, she was very gentle to everyone. Even when Barton and the other deformed children talked about her in private, they were full of praise. Dean also had a good impression of her. He remembered that her name seemed to be Lisa. Sure enough, he was still a little naive. At this time, when these adults heard Lisa's words, their eyes suddenly showed a trace of understanding. No wonder a child with such clean skin and such a delicate appearance would be abandoned. For a time, many adults felt sorry for her. Seeing the look of the adults, Lisa and other able-bodied children were relieved. Uncles and aunties. Suddenly, without any warning, a tender voice sounded from the crowd. All the children and adults were surprised. Suddenly, all the children's eyes widened as if they had seen a ghost. Because the speaker was Dean. In the past 3 months of orphanage life, Dean was silent every day and carefully observed and listened. He learned a lot of simple words. Moreover, the orphanage also had basic speech and pronunciation lessons. Even the most dilapidated orphanage was no exception. But there were 1-year-old babies. Although he didn't join them, but he eavesdropped and learned a lot. However, the people around him had long regarded him as a mute. They usually communicated with him using hand gestures, and no one took the initiative to chat with him. Therefore, he was too lazy to speak and was happy to be left alone. "There is nothing wrong with my body," Dean said calmly. The young and tender voice actually gave off an unquestionable illusion. He did not go out of his way to accuse Lisa of lying and take revenge on her, because there was no need to do so. The adults were surprised, but the next moment they seemed to understand something. They looked at Lisa with hidden anger in their eyes. They saw that the little girl was shocked. Soon the adults found that the other children were also surprised. They knew that the problem was not with the little girl, but with Dean. For a moment, many adults frowned. One of them, a sturdy and dark-skinned middle-aged man, said with a sullen face, "Judging from their expressions, they don't seem to know that you can speak. Can you tell me why you hid it from them?" The most taboo thing for the adults was to adopt a child who was full of thoughts and had no sense of security. Dean knew that he had stepped on a thread in the hearts of these people, but he was very calm and said, "I didn't deliberately hide it from them. It's just that I'm autistic and don't like to speak. They treated me as a mute, so I let them be." Hearing his words, the coldness in the eyes of the adults gradually relaxed. Most orphans had autism. They understood and understood it. Even if you're autistic, you've grown up in the orphanage. It's impossible that you haven't spoken a word, right? A fat woman in the crowd said suspiciously. Before Dean could speak, Aunt Di, who was next to him, rushed to say, "It's like this. This child loves to be clean, so we specially assigned him a separate room, so he has no chance to communicate with other children." As soon as these words came out, Dean, Barton, and the other children were slightly startled. They didn't know why Aunt Di would lie. In the orphanage, no child could enjoy a separate room. Dean's heart moved, and he immediately understood. On this point, today's orphanage was similar to the orphanages of the old era. They would package the children in the orphanage perfectly and cover up the flaws to the minimum. If these adults knew that Dean had only been in the orphanage for 3 months, no one would be willing to adopt him even if his conditions were good. Because children of 7 or 8 years old already had memories, they would definitely remember their biological parents. No one could guarantee that when they raised him into an adult, he wouldn't leave them to find his parents again. Understanding this, Dean's heart slightly sank. He glanced at the other children and saw that the able-bodied children and Lisa seemed to be ready to say something. At this moment, Dean saw Aunt Di's back facing the adults. She fiercely glared at Lisa and the children who were ready to speak, scaring them so much that their faces turned pale. In the orphanage, Aunt Di had the power of life and death over all of them. As long as Aunt Di said a word, they would never have the chance to be adopted. As for why Aunt Di was helping him, Dean certainly wouldn't be narcissistic to think that he had any special personality charm. It was because the sooner he was adopted, the less food the orphanage would consume. So that's how it is. The chubby woman saw Dean's snow-white complexion and suddenly understood. She looked at him sympathetically and said, "Child, I choose you. From now on, you'll be my child." As soon as these words came out, Barton and the other children who had a good relationship with him were immediately surprised, as if they were the ones who were adopted. They were happy for Dean. Hearing this, Dean immediately looked at the chubby woman's clothes and palms. Seeing her rough fingers, he could tell at a glance that she did hard work. He couldn't help but frown slightly. When he was about to open his mouth to refuse, suddenly another person laughed and said, "I think this child is very pleasing to the eye, and I think that with my conditions, I'm more suitable to be this child's parent." Everyone looked at the person who spoke. It was a plain-looking middle-aged man with a faint smile on his face. The chubby woman's face changed, and she said with a cold face, "Really? I'd like to know what kind of big shot you are." The middle-aged man smiled and said, "I'm not a big shot. I'm just a small gardener of the Mel family." Hearing this, everyone was startled. The children didn't have much reaction, but the adults around couldn't help but change their faces. One of them whispered, "Mel family? Is it that Mel family? Apart from that Mel family, which Mel family needs a gardener?" For a time, everyone looked at the middle-aged man with a bit of awe in their eyes. The chubby woman's face turned pale. She lowered her head and didn't say a word. "How about it, child?" The middle-aged man was very satisfied with the reaction of others. He looked at Dean with a smile. Lisa and the other children, including Barton and other deformed children, also saw the clues of the moment. They looked at Dean with envy and jealousy. It was good that they could be adopted, but Dean was being fought over by others. How could they not be jealous? Dean frowned and thought for a little bit. He shook his head. "I'm sorry, Uncle. Thank you for looking after me, but I hope that my parents are doctors. It will give me a sense of security." This was a tactful refusal. The middle-aged man was a little surprised. He didn't expect Dean to refuse. He had been to many orphanages to look for children who were fated to be adopted. Those children were excited when they heard that they could be adopted. How could they be as calm as Dean? Moreover, he spoke in an orderly manner. Soon, the middle-aged man woke up. Although the Maishan family was well known in the outer wall, the children didn't know about it. They didn't even know what a gardener was. After all, the world they lived in was too far apart. Dean certainly knew what a gardener was. Moreover, he knew from the expressions of the adults that the Mel family must be a colossus. But even if it was just a name, it was still not a big deal. Chapter 3. Doctor. The eyes of a young woman wearing a gray gown lit up when she heard Dean's words. She looked at Dean and said, "Kid, I'm a doctor. Are you willing to be my child?" Dudian had long noticed her. He didn't expect her to take the initiative to open her mouth. Originally, he had taken the risk to refuse the gardener. He thought that other people were afraid of offending the gardener, so they didn't dare to pick him. Now it seems that the other's identity wasn't that terrible. Dudian didn't know that doctors were rarer than he had imagined. Although they were still a civilian profession, but they were one of the few senior professions that could come into contact with aristocrats. If the Mel family's steward came, then naturally no one would dare to pick his child. But a mere gardener could only suppress some miners, tailors, and other first-class ordinary civilians. Dudian looked at her. The lines of her cheeks were very soft. When she smiled, there were two shallow dimples. He couldn't help but think of his mother's gentle appearance when she was preparing breakfast for him. He bowed his head in silence for a moment. Then he gently nodded. "I'm willing." The previous middle-aged man's face was slightly ugly, but he didn't say anything as he looked at the young woman. He secretly felt sorry for Dudian. After all, he was too young and his knowledge was too shallow. Although it was good to be a doctor, but not every child of a doctor could learn the skills of their parents. It was an extremely difficult profession to start. If they spent a lot of energy but didn't learn it in the end, then it would be too late to change to another profession. They could only become low-level coolies. But gardeners were different. As long as they had a good memory, they would be able to get started very quickly. Moreover, as a gardener of the Mel family, not only would they be able to get away from the dirty slums, but in the future they could inherit the gardener's identity and live in the Mel family for a lifetime. This was a good thing that other people wouldn't even dare to dream of. What a pity! The middle-aged man shook his head. The other children's faces turned ugly when they saw that the young woman had chosen Dudian. Barton and the other deformed children were a little bit better, although they were a little bit jealous, but more envious. But for the healthy children, it was no doubt that Dudian had taken away their precious opportunity. They couldn't help but feel resentment and jealousy. Aunt Di smiled. Dudian was one of the few children in the orphanage who was pleasing to her eyes. It didn't matter whether he was stupid or not. At least his white and clean skin was comfortable to look at. Aunt Di looked at the young woman. Dudian is very obedient and well-behaved. I hope that you will take good care of him in the future. I wish your family happiness. I will. The young woman's face was full of smiles, and she was very happy in her heart. Mina, take them to go through the household registration procedures. Aunt Di looked at the middle-aged woman next to her. The middle-aged woman, called Mina, waved to Dean and smiled at the young woman. Come with me. Dudian, don't forget us. Remember to come back to see us. Barton and the other deformed children were reluctant to leave. Dudian had been taken care of by them for the past 3 months. He smiled. I will come back. But don't be too discouraged. Maybe when I come back, all of you will have been adopted. Barton and the other deformed children laughed, although they were aware of the situation. I choose you. Dudian was about to leave when he heard the words of the middle-aged gardener. He couldn't help but look at the gardener. He saw the gardener pointing at Lisa in the crowd. Little girl, you are very well behaved. How about being my daughter? Lisa stared at him blankly, her face filled with disbelief. The other healthy children around her couldn't help but look at her with envy. Dean retracted his eyes and walked towards Aunt Mina. He followed her and his soon-to-be nominal mother as they left the open space. From now on, he and the other children in this orphanage would live in their own families. From now on, they would be separated from each other, and perhaps they would never meet again. The household registration procedures of the orphanage were very simple. First, verify the identity of the adopter. Second, verify the work certificate of the adopter. The purpose of the above 2 points was to confirm whether the adopter met the requirements of the law for adoption. If there was no work, or if the work was the cheapest labor, then the adopter was not eligible to adopt a child. The third point was to sign a contract to confirm the adoption relationship between the 2 parties. At the same time, the registration of the orphanage will be transferred to the name of the adopter. The last and most important point was the adoption fee. Yes, this was the main source of income for the orphanage in this world. In the old days, the orphanages only needed to meet the requirements for adoption and did not need money. But here it was different. Although it was called adoption, it was actually equivalent to selling. In a sense, it was the same as the old days of human traffickers. The only difference was that it was legal here. Dudian hadn't seen the money of this world yet. He saw his nominal mother take out a stack of thick green notes. It was the same size as the notes of the old days. There was a high giant wall printed on it. It was quite like the giant wall of Sylvia. Dudian saw her hand over the stack of notes to the smiling Aunt Mina. He knew why they accepted him so easily when he first came to the orphanage. It was obvious that the orphanage was so poor and the surrounding environment was so shabby. But they selflessly gave food and accommodation to an unrelated stranger. It turned out that he had lived here for a few months and brought them a lot of money. Dudian gently sighed in his heart. He felt that he should recognize the difference between the 2 worlds. Survival of the fittest. Either adapt to the world or let the world adapt to him. At this time, after paying the adoption fee, the young woman put away the signed contract. She bent over and stroked Dudian's hair. She gently said, "Child, I'm your mother. My name is Jura." Dudian looked at her light brown eyes. He knew that this woman would be the only one he could rely on in the future. He was silent for a moment and said, "Can I call you Aunt Ju first?" Jura was slightly surprised. Mina, who was sorting out the contract next to them, heard his words. "Don't be unruly. From now on, she's your mother. Treat her well. Don't lose the name of our orphanage." "It's okay." Jura smiled and stroked Dudian's hair. She gently said, "If you want to call me Aunt Ju, then call me Aunt Ju. I'll wait until you get used to it." There was a trace of warmth in Dudian's heart. He whispered, "Thank you." He was really grateful because he knew that once he was adopted, his life and death would be in the hands of the adopter. He also knew from the other children that in this world, even if the parents killed their own children, it was legal. Jura smiled. "Let's go back. I'll show you your new home." Jura's home was in the residential area. The people who lived here were all ordinary people with jobs. The living environment here was completely different from the slums. The smell in the air was much fresher. There was no smell of feces or rotting things. In the huge residential area, Jura's living conditions were relatively good. She lived in the southern part of the residential area. The price of the land here was twice as high as the northern part, because the northern part was close to the slums while the southern part was close to the commercial area. Those who could live in the commercial area were either big shots with military positions or rich businessmen. The amount of money they could casually spend was astronomical figures that some people in the residential area couldn't earn in their lifetime. Chapter 4. Jura took out a bunch of keys and opened the door. Dean looked at the slowly opened house. He knew that this would be the place where he would live for the next few days. Dean, come in. Jura took out a pair of adult cotton shoes from a small cabinet next to the door. She deliberately shook them in front of Dean, as if to tease him. These are Uncle's shoes. You wear them first. I'll take you to buy a new pair before the curfew. Dean was startled for a moment, but then he was relieved. One of the conditions for adopting a child was that the child must be married. In other words, he had a nominal father that he had never met. He consciously took off the dirty shoes on his feet. The rough shoes carved a few painful red marks on his feet. When he stepped on the clean cotton shoes, a burst of comfortable feeling came. Come, I'll take you to wash first, Jura said enthusiastically. Dean thought that he could have a comfortable bath, but he saw that she just soaked a towel with warm water, wrung it, and then helped him wipe his face and arms. This way of bathing was exactly the same as the way in the orphanage, but the color of the water was much purer. Dean did not know that in this world, including the nobles, they all used this dry cleaning method to bathe. People's general view was that water would weaken the human body's functions and reduce disease resistance. Even the most clean nobles would only take a big bath once or twice a year. After the bath, Jura let Dean familiarize himself with the house. She took the coarse clothes that Dean had changed out of. Dean walked around the room. As he expected, he didn't see any technological items. There wasn't even a simple clockwork alarm clock. Moreover, he saw an old textile machine that he had only seen in fairy tales. He remembered that the background of the fairy tale seemed to be the medieval period of Europe. At that time, the steam era had not yet entered. Although a single textile machine could not determine anything, Dean thought of everything he had seen in the past few months. In his heart, he was convinced that the degree of civilization in this post-disaster world should have just developed to the Bronze Age before the Steam Age. They had just learned to use metal. This discovery made some thoughts emerge in his heart. In the evening, the sky gradually darkened and the air became colder. It seemed that it was going to rain again. Jura was worried that Dean was afraid of the dark, so she lit the oil lamp early. The dim light swayed on Dean's face. Every time Jura saw it, she was amazed. It was too white, even whiter than her skin color. It's going to rain. Uncle hasn't come back yet. Dean looked out of the window and said. Jura smiled. She thought that this was really a good child. Uncle will be making a batch of goods in the next few days. I won't be back tonight. Are you hungry? What do you want to eat? I'll cook. Just eat whatever you have. You're such a good child. I'll let you taste my cooking. I'm sure you'll like it, Jura said confidently. In the blink of an eye, a month had passed. Dean had already met his nominal father. His name was Gray. He was a tall and thin middle-aged man. His appearance was ordinary, and his character was the same as Jura's. He was gentle, and his occupation was tailor. The textile machine at home was his workbench. During the black snow season, he would bring the goods to the house to work. After all, there was no charcoal and coal stove in the factory. Obviously, they had discussed about Jura's adoption. When he came home for the first time and saw Dean, his expression was the same as the adults in the orphanage. His face was full of surprise. When he found out that Dean was a little autistic and had no other problems, he was so satisfied that he couldn't stop smiling for a few days. Night. The common rainstorm of the rainy season came again. The rain pattered on the ground. Dean, who was sleeping in his small room, suddenly opened his eyes and sat up. He found out that it was just a nightmare. Then he felt his whole body was soaked with cold sweat. His clothes were stuck to his skin. It was a little uncomfortable. He shook his clothes and suddenly felt a rush of urine. He immediately got out of bed, put on his shoes, and gently opened the door. He found that there was a dim light under the door of Jura and her husband's room diagonally opposite. He couldn't help but be startled. It was so late, but they still hadn't slept. Dean's heart suddenly jumped twice. He didn't know what was going on in his mind, but he unconsciously approached the room. The building materials of this world obviously didn't consider the sound insulation effect. At least, there was no such thing in Jura's house. A subtle sound came from the room. "Do you really want to do this?" It was Jura's voice, with a bit of hesitation. "I know that you like this child very much. I also like him very much. To be honest, I also hate to part with him. But this is a rare opportunity. If Miss Averill can take a fancy to him, we can move to the commercial district. There, we can find a better job. If you feel lonely, we can adopt another child. Anyway, we can afford it. It's not a matter of money. I'm worried that if Dean marries into Averill's family, he won't like to talk. He will be bullied. They are people from two different worlds. I have seen children who marry into big families. Their lives are almost the same as servants. Some are even worse than servants." The room was silent for a moment. Gray's voice continued. "Jura, you should think of it this way. He is an orphan from the slums. If it wasn't for us, but if he was adopted by another serf family, his life would be worse than that of a servant. Moreover, he can live the life of a servant in Averill's family. I don't know how many people would envy him, but, well, this matter is decided. Whether it will succeed or not is another matter." The room was silent. The little figure at the door also fell silent. His little hands clenched into fists and then slowly loosened. He turned around, and as if dragging his body, he returned to his own room. It was as if he had even forgotten about the need to pee. Sitting on the bed, Dean listened to the sound of rain outside the window. He suddenly felt very sad. Although he had always regarded Jura and her husband as his nominal parents, but this month he was very touched by their meticulous care. His heart had a little more warmth. But he didn't expect that the world would once again, like a mockery, breaking some of the soft beauty in his heart. In the dead of night, he suddenly felt very lonely. His heart suddenly missed his knowledgeable father and mother, who were strict and gentle to him, and his sister, who always liked to pinch his ears. Why was he the incompetent one left behind? He clenched his fists, but his heart was very powerless. He didn't know how much time had passed. His heart slowly emerged an idea. Since he could no longer see his parents and sister, then let this strange world return to its familiar appearance. No one knew that in this rainy night, the gears of history, in the chest of this inconspicuous little figure in the dark, slowly moved forward. Chapter 5. The next morning, Gray was sitting in the main seat at the dining table. He was holding a residential newspaper that had been mailed this morning. There were news about various places in the residential area, as well as recruitment information from some factories. Jura was busy preparing breakfast in the kitchen. Everything was the same as usual. Dean's biological clock rang on time. He got up and folded the bedding. He washed his face and mouth with filtered well water. He came to the dining room and said, "Good morning," to Jura and her husband. Then he sat on his chair and started to eat his breakfast. At this time, Jura was also done with her work. She sat down opposite to Dean and smiled. "How is it? Does it taste good today?" "A little spicy." Dean took a bite. "I like spicy food." "That's good." Jura smiled. Gray put down the newspaper and looked at Dean, who was lying on the table. He said, "Dean, Aunt and I have chosen a marriage for you. You have to get ready today. Dress up and come with us to meet someone." Due to Dean's request, Gray and Jura were temporarily acting as aunt and uncle. Dean's heart had calmed down after last night's buffer. He pretended to be at a loss and asked, "Marriage? What is marriage?" Jura looked at him and whispered to Gray, "You see, I said that Dean is still young. It is not too late to get married in a few years. At the age of 13, it is the legal age for marriage." Gray looked at her. His eyes seemed to be slightly cold. "We're just going to get engaged." It is not a bad thing to get married in a few years. Jura saw that her husband had made up his mind. She sighed and no longer said anything. Gray looked at Dudian. We will take you to see a beautiful big sister. You have to seize the opportunity and do your best to get her approval. In this way, you will be able to eat a lot of delicious food every day. You will wear good clothes, and you will never be hungry again. Do you understand? Really? I will. Dean's heart was calm, but his face was full of surprise. After all, life was like a drama. It all depended on acting skills. Gray's face showed a smile. Good boy. Dean is a good boy. Come, let's eat first. Soon, the three of them finished eating. Dean's eagerness and enthusiasm made Gray feel relieved. The only thing left was to see if the lady would take a fancy to Dean. Come on, don't rush. Change into your new clothes first. Jura took out a brand new black suit, bright red tie, and shiny shoes from the cabinet and asked Dean to change into it. Jura and Gray's eyes lit up when he came out of the room. Dean's white skin was as white as snow, and his black eyes were like stars in the night sky. It's so beautiful, Jura exclaimed in admiration. Gray was overjoyed and said with a smile, Very good, let's go. Well, Dean was also very excited. Jura was the last one to go out. She locked the door and came to the side of the street in front of the lawn guardrail. She looked at Gray, who was holding Dean's hand. It's so early. Are there any carriages coming here? Gray smiled and said, I've already said that Averil's family will send someone to pick us up. Suddenly, the sound of hooves sounded. Dudian saw a carriage with golden wheels galloping over from the corner of the street. There was a silver-white flag engraved with a white flower on top of the carriage. The coachman was wearing a black top hat and black suit. He stopped the carriage in front of Dean and others. He jumped out of the carriage and smiled. You two must be Gray and Jura. Miss is waiting for you. Please get on the carriage. He gestured to his chest to show the aristocratic etiquette. Gray's heart skipped a beat. He was flattered. How can we trouble Miss to wait for us? It's really rude. Get on the carriage. He quickly carried Dudian into the carriage. At this time, the coachman also seemed to notice Dean. There was a trace of surprise in his eyes, but then he restored his polite smile. Duh. After they sat down, the coachman shook the rope and the carriage flew away. Dean silently looked at the passing buildings and pedestrians on the roadside. Pairs of surprised and awestruck eyes were looking at the carriage. At this time, Gray and Jura didn't speak. They didn't say anything to Dean. They were worried that the coachman's words would spread to Averil's family. The carriage quickly passed the south side of the giant wall. The young guards at the gate saw the white flower flag on the roof of the carriage. They clenched their fists against their chest and saluted. After the carriage left, they resumed their work and continued to check the identity of passers-by who wanted to enter the commercial district. Is this the commercial district? Dean looked at the clean streets outside the carriage and the well-dressed pedestrians on the road. He immediately felt the difference from the residential area. As for the slums, it was like the difference between heaven and hell. It was not an exaggeration. Soon, the carriage stopped in front of an elegant building at the end of the street. Dean saw a cardboard piano sign hanging on the building. The painting was very lifelike. He couldn't help but be surprised. He didn't expect that in this poor and incomplete world, there would be a piano preserved. The carriage stopped in front of the main entrance. At this time, a young man in a black suit came to the door. He looked at Gray and Jura, who got off the carriage. He smiled and said, Miss has been waiting for a long time. Please come with me. He turned and led the way. Gray looked at the gorgeous and exquisite building that was absolutely impossible to see in the residential district. There was a bit of inexplicable tension in his heart. He straightened his back and held Dean's hand as they walked in front. As they entered the hall, the bright light of the oil lamp shone on the faces of Gray and Jura. She had been invited to the commercial district several times for treatment, so she was a little calmer. It was the first time for Gray to come to such a place. Dean shook his head as he felt the man's body was slightly trembling. The murmuring music drifted over like flowing water. Dean looked around and saw that the hall was extremely spacious. There were many people sitting here eating snacks, listening to the music and chatting softly. They were dressed in very gorgeous clothes. The fabric was better than the fine thread and cotton used in the residential district. Some were silk, some were velvet sweaters. The colors were very bright. It was a clear contrast with the common primary color of the clothes in the residential district. The young man in the black suit gently made a gesture and went to a separate seat inside. Dean looked and saw two figures sitting there. One was a middle-aged woman, about 30 years old. She was wearing a well-tailored skirt. She had a beautiful face and looked very gentle. Next to her sat a little girl of about 11 or 12 years old. She had a fair complexion, brown hair, and an oval face. Although she hadn't matured, but she was definitely a beauty. The little girl also noticed Gray's family. Her eyes swept over the two adults and fell on Dean. There was a trace of surprise in her eyes. At this time, the middle-aged woman stood up and smiled at Jura. "Dr. Jura, last time my husband was cured thanks to you. Today he had business to deal with, so he couldn't come over. I hope you can forgive him." Gray hastily said, "Not at all. Mr. AI is very busy. We were rude." The middle-aged woman smiled. "Sit down first." "Yes, yes." Gray immediately pulled out a chair and sat down. Perhaps it was because he was too nervous, but the chair's leg knocked against the ground. Several people in the nearby seats who were whispering to each other immediately glanced sideways. When they saw the white metal pinned on the middle-aged beauty's gauze hat, their expressions changed and they withdrew their gazes. After Gray and Jura sat down, the eyes of the middle-aged woman fell on Dean, who was sitting on the chair. There was a trace of surprise in her eyes, but she was relieved. She smiled at Gray. "Is this your adopted child? He is so white." Gray was happy to hear her praise Dudian. He quickly said, "Not at all. Not like you, Mississippi. She is so beautiful at such a young age. Moreover, she is very intelligent. She has inherited your beauty." The middle-aged woman smiled and suddenly said, "About marriage," Gray's body tightened. Jura's expression was slightly nervous. "If Ania has no opinion, then it's settled." The middle-aged woman was unexpectedly frank. Gray and Jura looked at each other and saw the surprise in each other's eyes. "Mother." At this time, the little girl suddenly said, "I want to go out with him." Her eyes pointed to Dean as she spoke. The middle-aged woman seemed to have expected her words. She looked at Gray and Jura with the same smile. Gray responded, "Dean, you accompany Miss Anya to stroll around. Remember to take good care of Miss Anya." He patted Dean's shoulder to give him encouragement. At this time, Ania got down from her seat and took the lead to walk outside. She didn't look at Dean, nor did she stop to wait for him. Dean looked at the encouraging eyes of Gray and Jura, but his heart was very calm. After saying goodbye to the middle-aged woman, he turned around and followed Ania out of the hall. "This child is very sensible." The middle-aged woman looked at Dean's back and said with a smile, Fortunately, Gray said modestly. Ania looked at the young man in black suit who was following her. She waved her hand. "You don't need to follow me. I'm just walking nearby." "Yes, Mississippi," the young man in black suit answered. After he left, Ania continued to walk in front of him. She didn't look back or talk to Dean. It was as if she was walking alone. Dean had long learned to endure the loneliness. He quietly followed behind her and looked at the buildings on both sides of the street. From these customs, he could speculate the general level of living and technology in this world. After walking for a while, Ania suddenly stopped. Dean was so engrossed in the surroundings that he almost bumped into her back. He only smelled the faint fragrance of flowers from her clothes. He quickly took a step back to open the distance. At this time, Ania turned around. Due to her age advantage, she was slightly taller than Dudian by half a head. There was not the slightest expression on her beautiful white oval face as she quietly looked down at Dudian. This indifferent feeling made Dean faintly guess a possibility in his heart. He quietly looked up at her. Seeing Dean's calm appearance, Ania's eyes flashed a trace of surprise. But soon she restored her indifferent expression and said, "Have you heard of the opera Violet?" Dean was surprised. He didn't expect her to suddenly come up with this irrelevant question. He subconsciously wanted to answer no, but Ania didn't give him the opportunity to speak. She continued, "Have you heard of Mr. Fitz's music?" "No." Dean was about to say something. Do you know ballroom dancing? Ania's tone was indifferent. She didn't give him the opportunity to answer. Dean heard this and understood that this was not a polite question, but a question with undisguised contempt. He silently looked at the girl. Do you know horsemanship? Do you know swordsmanship? Do you have ideals and pursuits? Ania asked 6 questions in one breath. Then she calmly looked at Dean and said, If you are a smart child, you should have already understood that you and I are not people of the same world. Dean quietly looked at her beautiful face. He didn't expect that such sharp and even mean words would come out from the mouth of a child who was only 3 or 4 years older than him. Chapter 6. We don't have a common language. Ania indifferently looked at Dean and continued, If it wasn't for your mother who cured my father's illness, we wouldn't have any contact at all. But don't think that you can climb up to our family because of this kindness. Ania, will never find an incompetent husband who will make me lose face. Although you try to imitate elegance and cultivation, but in front of a real aristocrat, I can see the root of your bad habits at a glance. Commoners are commoners. You don't have the blood of the aristocracy flowing in your bones. No matter how much you learn, you can't hide your poverty and rudeness. Ania coldly looked at Dean. Although your appearance is very clean and different from those dirty and smelly workers in the residential district, but it's nothing strange. They don't know where they found you. They thought that I would take a fancy to you and let you marry into our Avril family. Then they would be able to live in the commercial district. What a joke. My father was polite to them, but they don't respect themselves. This is the gap between commoners and nobles. They don't know the importance of it. Dean quietly looked at her and waited for her to finish. Ania saw that there was no change in Dean's calm expression. She couldn't help but frown, but soon her face turned cold again. You may not understand what I said, but it doesn't matter. You just need to know that you are not worthy of me. I won't let you be my husband. If you want to marry into our Avril family, you and your adoptive parents had better give up. Otherwise, I will not let you live in the residential district. Dean quietly looked at her. Are you finished? Ania sneered. I'm finished. Say what you want to say. Dean smiled and looked directly in her eyes. First of all, I have to say thank you. Ania was stunned and a little stunned. Dean didn't pay attention to her reaction. First, thank you for refusing me, so that I can avoid the humiliation of marrying into your family. My father said that this is the basic bottom line of a man. Thank you for helping me. The father he was talking about was a strict, erudite, and gentle father. Ania was puzzled. Didn't your father humbly want to put you into our family? Second, thank you. Dean said, Thank you for letting me know that even a little girl like you can't be ignored. Ania's eyebrows twitched. She was precocious since childhood. She had planned her future when she was 8 or 9 years old. She was completely different from the children around her. She didn't expect to hear such an old-fashioned tone from the mouth of a child who was a few years younger than her. It was as if she was facing her childhood playmates. When she was ready to speak, Dean had already turned around and was ready to leave. Before leaving, he thought of something. He paused for a moment, but didn't look back. It seemed that he was talking to himself. Perhaps I don't know the horsemanship and swordsmanship that you mentioned. I can't learn the manners and manners of nobles. But I have ideals and pursuits. His voice fell, and he left along the original road. Only when his figure disappeared from Ania's sight did Ania react. She did not expect that this little commoner did not wait for her and dare to leave first. A surge of anger surged in her heart. Since young, she had cultivated a good temperament, so she rarely got angry. However, at this moment, she felt a ball of anger burning in her heart. Rather than anger, it was more like grievance. She gritted her teeth, stomped her feet, and followed up. Maintaining a ladylike posture, she followed at the fastest speed. When Dean returned to the corner of the concert hall, he heard Ania walking quickly behind him. Her walking posture was still elegant. He paused but didn't look back. When Ania came behind him, he opened his mouth. If the adults ask, you can say that you already have someone else in your heart. Ania was about to question him when she heard his words. She couldn't help but sulk. Why do I have to say it? I want you to go back and tell your adoptive parents that I don't like you. Let them give up on this idea. Dudyan indifferently said, if I didn't guess wrong, your father should agree to this marriage. But you don't agree. In other words, as long as I agree, it can be done. Am I right? Ania's face suddenly turned white. What Dean said was right. Her father did agree to this marriage. She and her mother came out today to put pressure on Gray couple so that they would give up on this idea. How do you know? You told me. Dudyan lightly said, if you have the choice, you can refuse this marriage in a simple sentence. There's no need to talk so much or even threaten me. Moreover, I think your mother is a bit too straightforward. So there must be something fishy about it. You can't directly refuse my adoptive parents, so you want to start with me. Ania was shocked. Dudyan said almost word for word. It was as if he had heard the discussion between her and her mother in advance. For a time, she suddenly felt that she couldn't see through the little boy. His calmness and calmness were something that even a teenager wouldn't have. However, she didn't regret her choice. After a moment of silence, she said, if I open my mouth, I'm afraid that your adoptive parents will find my father. Dudyan slightly shook his head. No, as long as you refuse, this matter will be over. Things are very simple. It's just that you think it's complicated. How do you know that? Ania frowned. She didn't like Dudyan's confident tone. Dudyan knew that she wasn't convinced. He could only patiently explain. You overestimate their courage and underestimate their self-esteem. They're just trying their luck and don't expect too much. Ania frowned and thought for a moment. Then I'll directly say that I don't like you. Why would I say that I have other admirers? I don't have any. Dudyan rolled his eyes. Aren't you a noble? Don't you know that you have to be tactful? How could they put their faces if they said that directly? Ania looked at him and suddenly snorted. Are you afraid that if I say so, they will think that you didn't perform well in front of me? So they will vent their anger on you? Dudyan wasn't embarrassed as he was seen through. He lightly said, anyway, I have taught you. What do you want to say? But you are responsible for the consequences. He walked out from the corner and went toward the concert hall. Ania looked at his back. She was so angry that she finally stomped her feet and followed. Miss, you are back. The youth in black suit saw Dudyan and Ania appear. He was relieved and smiled. Ania was worthy of being a noble. In just a few steps, the anger on her face had completely calmed down. She gently nodded and walked into the hall. The carriage with the white flower flag flew from the commercial district into the residential district. It stopped in front of 108 Lincoln Street. Dudyan family of 3 got off the carriage. The coachman shook the whip, and the carriage rushed away. Jura glanced at her husband's gloomy face. She took Dudyan to open the door. It's just an excuse. It's obvious that they despise our status. Nobles? I finally understand. They're just a bunch of hypocritical and arrogant fellows. At home, Gray vented his frustrations. Jura quickly said, Shoo, lower your voice. Don't let others hear it. Gray choked and didn't say anything. It was a big crime to talk about nobles in private. Jura said to Dudyan, Dean, you go back to your room and rest. Come out for dinner. You are tired today. Gray looked at Dudyan. His lips slightly moved, but he didn't say anything. He was disappointed in his heart. After getting along with Dudyan for a month, he knew that Dudyan was a good boy. He would never do anything impolite. He could only blame the other side's vision for being too high. Dudyan nodded and went back to his room. Half a month later, the rainy season that lasted for 4 months finally came to an end. On this day, the sun was shining brightly. Chapter 7. Dean nodded slightly. A few days ago, Gray and his wife had talked to him about this matter. They hoped that he could inherit Gray's sewing skills and become an excellent tailor. But Dean had a goal in his heart, so he directly refused. Gray couple was not angry. It was a good thing for a child to have his own ideas. They were not a serf family, so they were worried that their child would get into trouble. Unfortunately, it is too difficult to become a doctor. If you had followed me from childhood, then there would be hope to learn. Jura pinched the vegetable roll. She felt some regret. Dean was a smart child, but unfortunately, he was too late. When he became a doctor, He had passed the age where the doctor's senses were the most sensitive. "Tell me, what do you want to learn?" Gray smiled. Dean looked up at them and said, "Law. Law." Gray couple was startled. Jura asked, "Dean, do you know what profession this is?" "I know. It is one of the 3 civilian professions, just like doctors." When Dean got the list of professions given by Gray, he locked on to this profession. For him, it was the most suitable profession to understand the difference between this world and the modern world. Gray solemnly said, "You have to think clearly. Law school is the most difficult, even more difficult than being a doctor. It requires a very flexible thinking and logical ability. Although you are a smart and well-behaved child, you did not receive any basic learning in the orphanage. If you want to graduate from law school and become a qualified priest, it will be very difficult." Dean looked straight at him and insisted, "I want to learn this." Gray frowned slightly. This was the first time that Dean was so persistent in front of them. He did not know how to refuse. Since the last time he was rejected by Avril's family, some of his thoughts had faded. He regarded Dean as his real child, so he didn't want to easily hurt their feelings. Jura saw that Dean was so serious, so she pulled Gray's sleeve and said, "Since the child wants to learn, then let him learn. Even if he can't enter the magistrate, it is good to be an ordinary lawyer. At least he is familiar with the law and won't break the law. He will be safe." Dean looked at her and silently said in his heart, "I study the law, not to obey it, but to break it." Gray sighed and said, "All right, let's listen to him." Dean was relieved. He looked at them and said, "Thank you." Gray smiled as he heard Dudian's words. "Since you have chosen, then stick to it. If you don't want to learn, then come back and learn sewing for me. Be a textile worker, and you can support yourself." Dean nodded. When the Black Death season arrived, the temperature warmed up a lot. On the 3rd day before the academy reopened, there was a special holiday called the Day of Prayer. Every family gathered in groups and headed to the Cathedral of Weyer in the middle of the residential area. They prayed to God the Father to let them safely survive the Black Death season, so that the plague and disease would not befall them. It was a grand ceremony. Gray and his wife also went to pray with Dean. Dean saw the world's faith for the first time, the Holy Church. However, this was just a branch of the radiant church built in the residential area. A huge statue of a 4-winged angel was erected in the middle of the square. Its 2 arms seemed to embrace all the believers, full of benevolence and peace. The day of prayer passed. 3 days later, the various schools began to enroll students. Dean was led by Gray and his wife to the law school about 10 kilometers away from his home. He saw bustling parents and children waiting here. These parents and children were dressed in simple clothes and had clean skin. They were completely different from the ordinary workers who were emaciated or had rough skin. After all, the tuition of a law school was also notoriously expensive. Ordinary working families could not afford it. "I heard that if you want to enter the law school, you need to pass the assessment." "I already know. Do you think it is the same as the sewing school or the geology school?" "I don't know what the assessment will be." Some parents whispered to each other. Gray asked, "Is there an assessment for the law school?" "Of course, it is the same as our medical school." Jura blinked and bowed to Dean. "You have to work hard. I remember that the assessment will be some simple things. Our medical school tests memory. It should be the same here." Gray smiled at Dean. "It depends on your own performance. If you don't pass, we will go to the sewing school to sign up." Dean rolled his eyes in his heart. If it was really a memory test, he could kill the examiner in minutes. His IQ was 142. In the olden era, this was already considered a genius IQ. Those with an IQ of 120 to 140 were considered smart, and most people had an IQ of 90 to 110. As for that monster of a sister of his, her IQ was 168. That was what it meant to have a photographic memory. At the age of 12, she was accepted into Harvard University. The siblings' IQ was so high because they inherited the genes of their parents. Both of them were scientists who had won international awards. If it was not for the outbreak of the disaster, they would have won another international award with the invention of the freezing chamber. At this time, the parents in front went in one after another. Soon it was Dean's turn. "Parents, stop." Children come over to take the assessment. A middle-aged man stopped Gray and his wife. Dean, come on. Jura encouraged Dean, but Dean felt that the smile in her eyes was too cheerful. Entering the spacious room, he saw two middle-aged examiners, a man and a woman, wearing black robes with complex golden silk embroidery patterns, simple and gorgeous. They saw Dean, smiled, and said, "Child, come here." Dean stepped forward. "Let me ask you a question. You have a frying pan. It can only fry 2 fish at a time. It takes 1 minute to fry one side. How many minutes does it take to fry 3 fish?" The middle-aged woman on the left smiled. 3 minutes, Dean replied without thinking. The two examiners were surprised. The question was not difficult, but even some smart children needed to think a little before they could answer it. But Dean didn't think about it and directly said the answer. Moreover, it was correct. "You passed, child. You are very smart." The middle-aged man on the right smiled and said, "Take this and go to the side for a physical examination. If there is no problem with the physical examination, you can officially go to the law school." He handed a small note to Dean with a few words written on it. "There is a physical examination?" Dean frowned slightly, nodded, and turned to leave the room. "So difficult. I said 4 minutes, but they said I was wrong. Isn't it 4 minutes? If you want to fry both sides, it must take 4 minutes. There is a problem with this question. Why do you want to fry fish? I don't like to eat fish. What's the relationship between frying fish and the law?" "Yes, my father is a chef. He can fry 3 fish in 1 minute. They don't believe me, Humph." As soon as Dean came out of the room, he heard a few children coming out of the assessment room and complaining about the exam. His mouth twitched slightly. He pretended not to hear those words and turned back to the waiting Gray couple. "How is it?" Gray smiled. He also heard the children's words. Although he didn't know what the specific exam was, it seemed that it was not so easy to pass. Dean faintly looked at him and said, "Passed. Next is the physical examination." Gray's smile stagnated. He was somewhat discouraged, but when he thought that Dean was smarter than the other children, he beamed with joy. The physical examination is to test the radiation value in your body. Judging from Dean's skin color, the radiation value is certainly not high. There will be no problem for you to pass. Jurors seemed to know something. Dean's heart was moved. Nuclear radiation lines were everywhere in the world when the global nuclear war broke out. The silver-gray clouds in the sky also gathered a lot of nuclear radiation dust. That's why there was a rainy season. The rain was extremely dangerous for the world. It could even be fatal. If you got wet, you would get sick. If it was light, you would get sick. If it was heavy, you might even die. However, he had just come out of the freezer. He had lived here for a few months, so the radiation value in his body should not be high. However, he was very curious. What did these people use to test the radiation value? Was it an instrument? But the steam era hadn't entered here. How could they know about electricity? At this time, Jura took him to a room next to the physical examination. There was no line inside. After all, not many people could pass the first assessment. There was a middle-aged woman sitting inside. She saw the small note in Dean's hand and smiled. "Come over." Dean went forward and looked around. He didn't see any instrument, but there was a row of glass tubes that looked like thermometers. The middle-aged woman took the note from his hand and glanced at it. Seeing that it was real, she picked up a clean glass tube from the side. There was a fine scale on it. She pointed the sharp end at Dean's small hand and said with a smile, "Child, don't be afraid. It won't hurt." Dean didn't think that the thing to test the radiation value was such a small glass tube. The sharp end of the glass tube pierced into Dean's finger. Soon, dark red blood penetrated into the glass tube. At this time, Dean noticed that there was a hair-like red line on the scale of the glass tube. It rose slightly and stopped at the first grid at the bottom of the scale. The middle-aged woman looked at it and confirmed that she wasn't seeing things. She couldn't help but look at Dean in astonishment. She noticed that Dean's skin was much whiter than other children. Even the girls of the same age didn't have such a white skin. There was a trace of understanding in her eyes. She looked at the Gray couple next to her and said, "Such a low radiation value. It's the first time I've seen it. It's incredible. I guess only in the commercial district can such a healthy body appear." Jura obviously knew the radiometer. She was also shocked. She looked at her husband and said, "This is a radiometer. It's specially used to test the human radiation value. Dean's radiation value is quite low, even lower than ours. It's estimated that he's comparable to those noble children." Gray knew the importance of the human radiation value, but he didn't care. Juris said that he was comparable to the noble children, which made him happy. He lovingly stroked Dean's hair. Dean glanced at the red line on the radiometer. He suddenly felt that the line was slightly twisting. It seemed that it was a living thing. On the night of Dean's registration, in a castle in the commercial district, Chapter 8. The great figure on the desk did not raise his head, but gently nodded. The shadow who was kneeling on the ground saw the message, respectfully clenched his fist, and covered his chest. He quietly disappeared, leaving only a piece of white letter paper on the desk. After finishing the work at hand, the eyes of the stalwart figure fell on the snow-white letter. His blade-like thick eyebrows slightly raised. He opened it casually and glanced at it briefly. Seeing that it had indeed reached the passing line of less than 5 scale lines, he was just about to put it down when his eyes suddenly focused on the test value at the bottom corner. 08. The great figure stared at the number for a while. He put away the letter paper, got up, and put on the coat on the coat rack at the door. Then he opened the door. In the hall, the slightly fat middle-aged butler looked at the master and was surprised. "Master, are you going out so late?" "Well," the great figure ordered, "prepare the car. 300 years ago, a natural disaster came to the world. Our ancestors fought bravely and relied on their infinite wisdom and strength to survive in the face of adversity. They built this giant wall of Sylvia to isolate the disaster outside the giant wall and protect all of our descendants. The giant wall of Sylvia is sacred and great. You must not blaspheme the giant wall. Do you understand?" A white-bearded old man on the podium said solemnly. Don't look at his white beard. In fact, he had just reached 60 years old. But here, this was considered as a long life. Dean listened carefully. 3 days after his registration, the school officially started. This was his first class of the day. The old man did not explain the knowledge of the law, but simply introduced some well-known things. It seemed that the purpose was to familiarize the children and consolidate the faith in the hearts of the children. About the story of the giant wall of Sylvia. As long as they were not orphans, almost every child had heard countless times from their parents. The other children were bored, but because it was the first time they saw the white-bearded old man, they were somewhat afraid of strangers and did not dare to be rash. Dean listened with relish. These were the things he wanted to know the most at the moment. Seeing that the old man seemed to be bored, he could not help but raise his hand and asked, "Teacher, what is the natural disaster you're talking about?" White-bearded old man and the other children were surprised. They didn't expect Dean to be so bold. He dared to take the initiative to ask such a well-known question. The old man saw Dudion's serious and hopeful face. He couldn't bear to discourage the child's enthusiasm. But in his heart, didn't the child's parents tell him? He replied with a smile, "There are many natural disasters, such as volcanic eruptions, floods, earthquakes, and so on." Dudion was startled. "Is that all?" The old man was a little speechless. These disasters are already very terrifying. Didn't you hear your parents say that just the volcanic eruption alone can kill countless people? Do you see the dark clouds in the sky? That's caused by the volcanic eruption. Dean slightly frowned and did not say anything, but his heart was thoughtful. He knew that the disaster of 300 years ago was not a simple natural disaster, although all kinds of disasters that the old man said had happened, but they were caused by nuclear explosions. The reason why he asked was that he wanted to see the information left by the survivors. It was obvious that the future generations did not know the real cause of the disaster and the inside story. Perhaps the inside story was too terrible, so it was blocked by the rulers. "Teacher, my mother said that it is very dangerous outside the giant wall. If we go out, we will die. Is this true?" A little fat boy saw Dean's question and also raised his hand to ask. The old man looked solemn and seriously said, "Yes, there are devils and plagues outside the giant wall. Once you go out, You will never come back. We can sit here and study. We can eat rice and vegetables. It is all thanks to the giant wall. So you have to respect the giant wall and respect the wall builders. This is a great profession like doctors and us, the law keepers. The law keepers referred to people who study law. Children like Dean, who had just started to study law, were called trainee law keepers. If they graduated and passed the magistrate's assessment, they could become a magistrate. It was a very sacred existence, as noble as the aristocracy. Not only could they freely enter and exit the commercial district and residential district, but they could also enter the inner wall area. Devil and plague. All the children were scared. Even if they were small, they knew how terrible these two things were. Dean was curious. He naturally did not believe in the devil. Nuclear bombs had baptized the world, and 99% of the creatures were extinct. This was just a fabricated story to scare the children. Of course, the target of intimidation may not only be children, but also adults. This made him more curious about the world outside the giant wall. What was it like? Was it still full of nuclear bomb explosions? Or because no one had developed it, it had become a virgin forest? Time is up. Class is over. The white-bearded old man looked at the hourglass and said. The other children immediately cheered. At this moment, two young people wearing black leather armor suddenly appeared at the door. They walked into the classroom as if there was no one else present. The white-bearded old man was about to speak, but suddenly noticed the black eagle medal on their shoulders. His face suddenly smiled and greeted them. "Two sirs, are you here to take the children away?" Dean's ears pricked up. He was somewhat vigilant and puzzled. One of the thin young men nodded slightly. He looked indifferent and meticulous. "Now I will call the roll. Those who are mentioned by me, stand up. Do you understand?" His cold eyes swept across the audience. There was no softness in his eyes because the target was a child. All the children were immediately subdued and nervous. The white-bearded old man quickly appeased them. "Don't be nervous. These two sirs are guards. Those who are mentioned by them will have hope to join the public service. This is a great event." Public service? Dean had heard Jura talk about it. In short, it was equivalent to the civil servants of the old era. They didn't have to worry about their livelihood for a lifetime. In this world, it was the dream of many civilians. However, Dean noticed the medals on the shoulders of the two guards. When he entered the residential area from the slums, he didn't see such medals on the guards. The standard leather armor was also different. Moreover, there was no reason for a guard to be so in awe of a teacher. This made a trace of doubt emerge in his heart, and he immediately quietly watched. "Lock!" the black-armored young man shouted. A thin child on the table in front of Dean was scared and weakly said, "Stand up!" The black-armored young man shouted. The thin child was scared and immediately jumped up. "Marta!" "Yes." A girl quickly stood up. "Lemuel!" "Carly!" The children stood up one by one. The young man shouted, "Dean!" Dean's eyes narrowed as he slowly stood up. There were a total of 8 children, including him. Chapter 9. The 8 of you come with us. The thin young man looked at Dean and said indifferently. He turned and left the classroom with his companions. The white-bearded old man saw that Dean and the other 8 children didn't move and quickly said, "Hurry up. This is your luck. Others want it but don't have it." Hearing his words, several children looked at each other. One of the taller children stood up and took the lead to follow the old man. The rest followed one after another. Dean walked at the end of the line, quietly observing the selected children and the children who were not selected. He wanted to find a reason why he was selected by comparison, but soon found that there seemed to be no common ground. At least from skin color, appearance, and other external appearance, there was no obvious difference. If there was no external, then it must be internal. He suddenly thought of the physical examination before school. His eyes narrowed. It seemed that this was the most suspicious. While he was thinking, he followed the other children to the huge playground outside the law school. As soon as he arrived here, Dean saw a black carriage parked at the entrance of the school. The carriage wheels were embedded with iron bars and huge rivets. At first glance, it looked extraordinarily strong. The horse pulling the carriage was even more amazing. It was nearly 3 meters high and wearing a helmet. It stood there like a beast. Dean was not the only one who was surprised. The other children were even more stunned. "Come, get on the carriage," the thin young man said. All the children hesitated for a while. The tall child who walked in the front seemed to consciously shoulder the identity of the leader. He boldly asked, "Excuse me, where are we going?" The thin young man stared at him coldly and said, "Get on the carriage." The cold and sharp eyes made the tall child's whole body tremble. His hair stood up and his face turned pale. He did not dare to ask anything more. He carefully avoided the giant horse and climbed up the carriage. When the other children saw this, they kept quiet out of fear and obediently followed behind. The carriage was extremely spacious. It was more than enough to accommodate 8 children. Dean sat in the corner, next to 2 nervous children. He quietly looked at the black-armored youth who jumped into the driver's seat. He suddenly felt that he had to make something to save his life as soon as possible. This world was more dangerous than he had imagined. Although there were laws, it was obvious that some existences could ignore the laws. As for human rights, in a feudal society where serfs and aristocrats existed, human rights did not include equality and freedom. The carriage galloped away from the law school. The buildings on both sides of the road quickly retreated. It didn't take long for Dudian to see a high wall. There was a big word engraved on the wall. Dudian had learned a lot of words from Jura in the past few months. He knew this word. It was the word poor. Dean recognized that it was the wall from the residential district to the commercial district. Was the carriage going to take them to the commercial district? The other children obviously recognized this as well, and when they thought of the white-bearded old man's words, the nervousness in their hearts was immediately replaced by surprise, and their faces were filled with excitement. Even a child yearned to enter the business district where the nobles and the rich lived and see the scenery inside. Dean was not surprised. Being able to take people directly from the law school showed that the power behind these people was great, but he did not know what their purpose was. Was it good or bad? Soon, the carriage flew past the music hall building that Dean had previously come to. Seeing this building, Dean could not help but think of the little girl's sharp, questioning words. Suddenly, he felt a little funny. Although he thought that sooner or later he would step into the commercial district, he did not expect to come back in just a month. Not long after, the black carriage came to a castle. The thin young man in front jumped down, opened the door, and shouted to the crowd, "Get off." All the children obediently got off the carriage. Dean was the last one, but when he was about to get off the carriage, the thin young man suddenly said, "You don't have to get off." Then he returned to the driver's position, shook the whip, and drove the carriage away. Only the 7 children who got off the carriage were left in the same place. Dean's face slightly changed, and his heart was slightly raised. He opened the curtain and saw the figures of the 7 children gradually go away until they disappeared. Suddenly, a middle-aged man in a black suit came out of the castle and came to the front of the children. The carriage passed a corner, and the line of sight was blocked. Dean took back his eyes and sat alone in the empty carriage. His mind was turning fast. Escape? Resist? Obviously, with the other party's power, he could only let himself be slaughtered. Soon, the carriage stopped in front of a manor. It was an extremely vast manor, with white lacquered wooden guardrails outside. The green grass inside was trimmed extremely smoothly. At the moment, there were several gardeners sprinkling water on the lawn. The thin young man opened the door and looked at Dean. There was a trace of a smile on his indifferent face. "Little guy, you are quite calm." Dean saw his smile and was slightly startled. The tension in his heart slowly relaxed. He asked directly, "Is it because of the radiation value?" The thin young man seemed to have changed into a different person. With a smile on his face, he said, "It's quite clever. Yes, they're barely qualified. Even if they pass the training, they can only be scavengers. But you have hope to join as hunters." Scavengers? Hunters? Dean heard these 2 terms, and his heart moved. Seeing that the man seemed to become easy to talk to, he asked, "What is a scavenger? Come down first." The thin young man stretched out his hand and took Dean out of the carriage. He led him to the manor and said, "Scavengers are responsible for opening up a safe zone outside the giant wall, looking for available resources." Outside the giant wall? Dean was surprised. Unexpectedly, they were working outside the giant wall. The white-bearded old man obviously knew this point. Previously, he had said that there were devils and plagues outside the giant wall. They must not go out. But in the blink of an eye, they were sent out. What luck! Hold the grass, ah! Although he did not believe in devils, but there was no doubt that the outside of the giant wall was extremely dangerous. At least the radiation in the air was much higher than inside the giant wall. Wait, radiation? No wonder the radiation value was used to distinguish scavengers and hunters. Most of the time, the environment outside the giant wall was extremely harsh and the radiation was extremely high. So people with high radiation in their body would easily reach saturation outside the giant wall. So they could only choose people with low radiation value to go to the giant wall. Chapter 10. What about the hunters? Dean couldn't help but ask, are they going to the dangerous area outside the giant wall? Is there any danger outside the giant wall? Speaking of this, he couldn't help but think of a terrifying figure in his mind. His face became pale. Fortunately, his skin was white, so it wasn't too conspicuous. "You are smart." The thin young man smiled. "Outside the giant wall. Fino." Another young man frowned. "We haven't confirmed his identity." "Don't say too much." The skinny young man named Fino was stunned for a moment. He shrugged his shoulders and said, "It doesn't matter. His radiation value is 0. 8 scale, not more than 1. Basically, he has a light physique. Don't make a conclusion before the test." Another young man frowned. Fino thought for a moment and bowed to Dean. "We can only wait until you pass the test, but someone will explain it to you at that time." Dean was slightly startled as he heard their dialogue. "Light physique? What is this?" "You will know in a moment." Fino smiled mysteriously. At this time, the three entered the manor. Several gardeners saw Fino and Dudian and nodded respectfully. Along the white stone path in the middle of the lawn, the three of them came to the front of the castle. The giant gate, which was more than 10 meters high, slowly opened. Fino led Dean into one of the tall towers. Along the winding steps, they came to a dark top room. Along the way, they saw a large number of servants. These people saw Fino and Dudian and respectfully called them master. Dean looked at the dark room. There was no window. The only ventilation window was covered by a black curtain. Perhaps it was because they hadn't seen the sun for a long time. The air in the room was cold, like the temperature in the early rainy season. In the center of the room, there was an isolated metal platform covered with a black cloth. Fino stepped forward and opened it, revealing a smooth crystal ball. White cold air rose from the crystal ball. It turned out to be a pile of ice. "Come, little guy." Fino took out a sharp knife from the inside of the black leather armor and looked back at Dean. "Come here." Dean saw that he still had a smile on his face and there was no killing intent, so he slowly moved forward. Suddenly, he saw that there was a very pure white worm in the almost transparent crystal ball. If he didn't look carefully, it would be almost impossible to see. "This is a light worm that likes to live in cold environments." Fino smiled and said, "If you have a light physique, it won't eat your blood." She grabbed Dean's small hand and moved it to the top of the crystal ball. There was a small round hole at the top. The crystal ball was actually a container. Dean felt a slight pain in his fingers. A drop of blood dripped from his fingerprints and fell into the round hole, sliding inside. At this time, the light worm that was sleeping soundly in the crystal ball seemed to be disturbed and woke up from its sweet dream. It raised its head slightly towards the place where the blood slid, as if it was sniffing. The next moment, it crawled towards the blood. Seeing this scene, Fino's expression changed, and the other young man also frowned. Dean thought of Fino's previous words, and his heart sank. The light worm quickly crawled in front of the blood. Then its body was like a sponge, sucking in the blood. Its pure white body also became a touch of red, but this redness soon dissipated, and it returned to its pure white state. Impossible. Fino frowned and murmured, "Is it too hungry because it hasn't eaten for a long time?" He cut his finger with a knife in his hand, and blood dripped down. However, the light worm didn't even look at it. It crawled back to the bottom of the crystal ball and curled up. Fino's face was gloomy. Without saying a word, he pinched Dean's small hand and quickly cut it. When the blood fell into the crystal ball, the light worm crawled over and quickly absorbed it. Really not. Fino seemed to be a little discouraged. He let go of Dean's small hand and put away his knife. The other young man looked at Dean and indifferently said, "It seems that your previous family was very good." Dean already knew the reason of the matter. Fino's light physique meant that the body's immune antibodies to radiation were higher than the average person, so the body's radiation content was lower than the average person. People with this kind of physique were looking for hunter partners. But Dean was not like this. Because he came out from the freezer, his contact with the world was too short, so the body's radiation content was not high. Hearing the other young man's words, Dean immediately understood the meaning of his words. It seemed that these people had investigated him and knew that he and Jura were adopted. Most of them knew that he didn't stay in a Mysian orphanage for a long time. The reason why they said so was that they mistakenly thought that he was a child abandoned by a noble or rich family. Only the food and drink of these families were repeatedly filtered, so the radiation content was extremely low. I didn't expect that it was just an abandoned rich kid. I was happy for nothing. Fino was disappointed inside. Dean was not disappointed. Once he became a hunter, he would have to go to dangerous areas. Although he didn't know what the danger was, but it was better not be the danger he imagined. The other young man looked at Dean and said in a cold voice, "Little guy, you can't say anything about this, including the word hunter. Is this authority suppression?" Dean nodded and said, "I will keep my mouth shut." The young man saw that Dean was so obedient, and the coldness in his eyes faded a little. He coldly snorted and said to Fino, "Fortunately, your big mouth didn't say too much, or we would have to deal with this little guy." Hearing this, Dean's heart was cold. His life was almost inadvertently ruined. At the same time, he felt a bit angry at the young man's cold words. In the eyes of the young man, there was no respect for life. But soon he was disappointed. In this world, perhaps life was really cheap like grass. Thinking of this, he increasingly felt that he had to make one or two life-saving things. Otherwise, he would die in an unknown way and go to hell. How would he have the face to face his parents who had given him life twice? I can't make firearms now, but gunpowder seems to be possible. Some thoughts secretly flashed in his mind. Fino and the other young man didn't know what kind of terrible weapons were in the mind of the child at their legs. Fino's face was still full of regret. He said to Dean, "Let's go, little guy." There was no half of the previous enthusiasm and friendliness in his attitude. "Where to? Do you still need to ask?" "Go to the place where you should go. Remember, don't talk about us to anyone, including your parents. If you are found to have leaked the secret, then you can only blame your own bad luck." Chapter 11. When they left, Fino drove alone. He didn't go to the scavenger's castle that Dean had seen before, but went directly to the residential area. He stopped under the high wall and let Dean get off the car. "Don't I have to be a scavenger?" Dean was puzzled. Fino jumped back into the carriage and said impatiently, "We have already tested you, so you don't need to go there again. In a few days, someone will take you to report." With that, he shook the reins in his hand, and the black carriage sped away. Dean frowned slightly. He turned and walked along the street towards Jura couple's house. Fortunately, he had followed Ayer's carriage back once and remembered the route. Otherwise, he would have gotten lost. By the time he returned to 108 Lincoln Street, he was tired and panting. His body was sweating and his legs were sore. Although Jura couple's house was not far from the high wall, only 7 or 8 miles away, but his body hadn't recovered from the cold storage. His physical strength was much weaker than the average child of the same age. Jura couple stood in front of the door and looked around. When they saw Dean appear from the corner of the street, their eyes lit up and they quickly greeted him. Gregor said, How come no one sent you? Did you walk back by yourself? Jura gave him a white look. Let's go back first. Gregor came to his senses and immediately picked up Dean's tired and weak body. He quickly went back to the house. After closing the door, Jura found a cotton towel to wipe Dean's sweat. She asked with concern, "Child, are you okay? Those people didn't do anything to you?" Dean saw their reaction and knew that most of them knew something. He asked, "Do you know? Someone came to inform us that you are qualified to join the guards." Gregor looked at Dean's flushed face and suspiciously asked, "Did you pass the test?" Dean thought that his identity as a scavenger also needed to be kept secret. "I have passed. In a few days, someone will take me to report, but I don't want to go. Can I refuse?" If he could choose, he would like to learn the law first, master more things, and then go outside the giant wall to see the scenery there. Gray heaved a sigh of relief and said in amusement, "Do you know how many people want to go but don't have the chance? You still want to refuse? Being able to become a guard will allow you to not have to worry about food, drink, sickness, and death for the rest of your life. You just have to stand guard every day, and you will have a large salary. Furthermore, no one will dare to bully you. How great is that?" Jura gently looked at Dean. "Do you still want to learn the law?" Dean nodded seriously. "I asked for you." Jura smiled and said, "When you go there, you can learn the law. Not only the law, but also medicine, geology, sewing, and so on. It's a comprehensive school." "School?" Dean was startled. Many people couldn't tell the difference between a college and a school. To put it simply, a college specialized in one field, such as law school or sewing school, while a school was made up of many colleges, and the things they learned were very comprehensive. What's the point of learning the law? When you become a guard, you won't have to worry about anything. Gray patted Dean's shoulder, smiled, and encouraged him. "I heard that there will be elimination in the training. You have to concentrate and don't get eliminated." Dean's heart relaxed. Comprehensive study. This was exactly what he wanted. "Auntie." Dean seized the opportunity and said to Jura, "I want to borrow some pocket money. I will definitely return it to you later." Jura was surprised for a moment, then laughed. "How much do you want? I'll give it to you. There is no need to borrow or return. We are a family." "Yes." Gray smiled and said, "I have lived here for so long. Dean should change his words." Dean pretended not to understand his words. He estimated in his heart, about 100 copper coins. So much. Jura and Gray were surprised. 100 copper coins was almost equal to their living expenses for half a month. Gray asked, "What do you want to buy that you need so much?" Dean had long thought of a reason. "I want to buy something to eat and go back to visit my friends in the orphanage." Then he silently said in his heart, "I will borrow you first, and then go back to visit you later." Jura smiled and said, "That's right. Here you go." Then he took out a stack of green copper coins from his wallet, counted them, and handed them to Dean. Since the emergence of printing technology 10 years ago, the Star Sea Bank, under the management of the giant wall of Sylvia, had issued a large number of banknotes. In just a few years, the banknotes had replaced the coins and circulated to every household in the residential area. People had gradually become accustomed to using light banknotes to trade. "Thank you." Dean immediately took it and put it in his pocket without counting it. Seeing this, Gray didn't say anything more. He waved his hand and asked Jura to prepare dinner. The next morning, Dean got up on time. After washing and eating breakfast, he said goodbye to Jura and Gray and went straight out. Although he did not know when the scavengers would send someone to pick him up, he did not need to go to law school for the next few days. Sulfur. Dean vaguely remembered the method of making gunpowder. It was a festival when his sister told him to make firecrackers, but he did not know what else was needed in addition to sulfur. After all, he was still young at that time and was not interested in these things. Dean did not go directly to buy sulfur, but called a carriage and went to the slums to get something that belonged to him. Soon after entering the slums, Dean went directly to the direction of the Maischen orphanage. Then, when he was 4 streets away, he turned into a remote and broken street. Along the way, the smell of feces and rotten insects made him slightly frown. It didn't take long for him to come to a huge garbage dump. The garbage dump in the slums was really a garbage dump. Here, you absolutely could not find anything of value. It was a fool's dream to want to find treasures in it. Therefore, even the poor would not come here because all the items that were discarded here had long been turned over. Dean stood far away and could smell a strong rancid smell mixed with feces and urine. Many poor or homeless people were happy to solve the problem of excretion here. There were 7 or 8 black garbage dumps, and they were as huge as hills. Dean came to one of the garbage dumps, looked around, and after confirming that there was no one nearby, he squatted down and lifted a black cloth full of garbage and unknown mucus. This black cloth revealed a small hole, just enough to accommodate his thin and small body. Chapter 12. Dean took off his coat and put it on a slightly dry ground. Once again, he climbed into the garbage hole. Fortunately, there was no steel or glass in the garbage. After all, steel could be recycled, and no poor people would abandon it. As for glass, the poor people couldn't afford it. The pungent stench continued to erode Dean's brain, making his stomach tumble. From time to time, his palms would touch a wet and soft object. In the darkness, he couldn't imagine whether it was a pile of feces or a rotten and swollen rat corpse. Here, even a sloppy poor person would feel that death was better than living. Dean clenched his teeth tightly. After climbing for 7 or 8 meters, he finally touched a hard object. It was his freezer. He touched along the edge of the shell and quickly found a button and pressed it. Fingerprints are being verified for you. The cold mechanical voice sounded from the darkness. Soon, with a click, the freezer opened. The force of opening the door pushed the garbage above slightly, but more garbage fell into the freezer, almost filling up the place where he used to sleep. Dean glanced at the door. There was a 2-finger-wide red number, 300. This was the year. It was this number that let him know that he woke up after 300 years. The reason why it was a full 300 years was that the 3 energy tubes of the freezer could only supply 300 years of freezing. This was the limit. Dean reached inside and quickly touched a raise button. With a click, the cabin popped out a built-in alloy plate, which was supported by several mechanical brackets and a palm-sized screen. Scanning iris. The previous mechanical voice sounded from the cabin, and the palm-sized screen emitted a ray of light. Dean immediately went up and aimed at his eyes. Verification passed. The mechanical voice sounded again, and a 3-dimensional virtual image was ejected from the screen. There were 2 options, start and exit. Dean slightly gritted his teeth and chose start. When the disaster broke out, he was not the only one who was frozen. There was also this super chip. It could be said that this was the essence of the civilization of the entire old era. It stored all the technology of the old era, as well as the social history of various countries. Although these were all information things with patterns, it did not take up much memory. But the thousands of years of social development and scientific and technological development of various countries added up to at least tens of thousands of gigabytes of storage. Dean thought of his father's last words. Remember, you must rebuild human civilization. Obviously, to be able to consider using the freezer to avoid the disaster, his father had also considered the problem of human survival after the disaster. The global nuclear explosion caused a devastating blow and the fault of civilization, and the things in this super chip covered all the crystallization of the wisdom of the old era. The basic principles of making gunpowder and firearms were naturally included. This world doesn't have electricity yet. Fortunately, the remaining energy in the freezer can maintain the basic operation of the freezer, even though it can't be used for cryonics. I can use it for at least a few months to learn this. Dean estimated that the power consumption of this small screen was lower than that of a laptop. It might not even consume a kilowatt hour in 24 hours. However, Dean didn't have so much time to stay here. He didn't have time to come here often. Otherwise, it would arouse the suspicion of Jura and her husband. I can only hurry up. For the time being, I will learn how to make gunpowder and generators. By the way, I will look at the tools of the steam era. Dean lay on the edge of the freezer and began to learn seriously. The surroundings were full of stench, decay, and the unpleasant smell of mixed feces and urine. He endured it. Gradually, he seemed to adapt to it. Instead, his mind was attracted by the content of the super chip, and he devoted himself to it. Sulfur decomposition, what improved steam engine. In this narrow and dark garbage hole, Dean concentrated on learning. Time passed unconsciously. Dean wasn't completely absorbed. His concept of time was very strict. At about 4 o'clock in the afternoon, at dusk, he rubbed his sore eyes and quit the super chip's teaching. He didn't eat or drink for a whole day. He felt that there was a fire burning in his stomach. I don't know when I can come next time. The outside of the freezer is covered with moss and volcanic ash. It was thrown here as a strange rock, but the last time the door was opened, the rock layer was also cracked. If it is seen again, they will definitely notice that it is metal. I must take the super chip away. Dean made a decision. It was too dangerous to continue to leave the super chip here. He didn't bring the super chip when he was in the Mycian orphanage. That was because the children in the orphanage slept together. It was inevitable to be noticed. Now it was different. He lived in a residential area. For the people there, a small piece of metal was not worth looking at. Even if he went to the scavenger training ground, it would not attract any attention. Dean disassembled the memory card slot behind the player and pinched out the small chip the size of a fingernail. Because the energy pipe of the freezer was connected to the circuit of the freezer, it couldn't be disassembled. Without a mobile power supply, the player would lose its function. Looking at this small chip, Dean sighed in his heart. Thousands of years of human history and technological inventions were compressed into this small object. If the rulers of the world knew the value of this chip, he didn't know what crazy things they would do. Cautiously putting away the chip, Dean closed the freezer again. He secretly thought that he could see it again the next time he came. He struggled to change direction and crawled out of the garbage dump. It was only 7 or 8 meters, but it was like a baptism in hell. When he crawled out of the exit, the air outside was slightly less stinky. It was so fresh when he breathed into his nose. He took a few deep breaths and looked around, seeing that no one was paying attention to him, and his coat was still on the ground. He did not stay any longer. After picking up the coat, he quickly left the garbage dump. Not far from the garbage dump, there was a low-lying place where the radiation rain had accumulated a few days ago. The water was quite clear. Dean was too lazy to care about the radiation. He dropped his coat and washed his arms and chest with the water. Anyway, he had the super chip. As long as he could make a stable power supply early, he could find a way to reduce the radiation in his body. Previously, he searched for the method to purify the radiation in the chip, but time was limited, so he didn't look at it. After all, it was useless to look at it now. Soon, his body was a little cleaner. The sticky things on his body were wiped off, especially his left hand, which was stained with feces, making him nauseous. Chapter 13. Dean dragged his body back to the residential area. He spent 5 copper coins to call a carriage near the high wall and sent it directly to Lincong Street. It was too late today, so he had no time to buy sulfur and saltpeter. Moreover, in a few days he would go to the scavenger training. Judging from the degree of secrecy of this organization, most of the things brought there would be strictly checked. Although in this world people only knew how to use sulfur for dyes and pesticide production, but it was also a low-toxic, dangerous product. Jura and her husband were obviously anxious. When they saw Dean come back, they were obviously relieved. The next moment, they smelled a strong stench. Gray frowned and pulled away. "What's wrong with your body? Why are you so dirty?" Dean coughed and said, "I fell in the slums." "Why are you still asking? Hurry up and take a bath. I'll boil some hot water for you." Jura pinched her nose and ran to the kitchen. Dean went into the bathroom and put the super chip into a crack in the floor. After a while, Jura brought a basin of warm water. "You need to take a bath. Do you want me to help you?" "No." Dean quickly refused. "Well, then you wash yourself slowly. Wash yourself clean." Jura put the water on the ground and turned to go out. Dean looked at the small basin of water and smiled slightly in his heart. He suddenly missed the old showers. Unfortunately, in this world, the radiation in the water couldn't be completely filtered, at least in the residential area. This made him eager to step into the commercial area as soon as possible. 3 days later, a tall carriage came to the door of Jura and her husband's house. The carriage was pulled by a very strong horse. It was about 2 meters high and was wearing exquisite armor. Its black hair was mixed with some brown hair. It seemed like a hybrid breed. A young man wearing a soft armor came down from the carriage. He was thin but stood straight like a spear. He looked at the house number and went forward to knock on the door. Jura and her husband, who were eating breakfast, saw the carriage from the window. Their hearts unanimously said, "Come in." Jura immediately went to open the door and enthusiastically said, "Please come in." The young man saw that she seemed to know his purpose, but he still showed his identity card. It was a medal with crossed swords, representing the identity of a guard. He didn't enter the house. He said, "No, I'm in a hurry. This time I'm here to take your children to the military training ground in the commercial district. You must have received the notice from the top. Then get ready. I'm in a hurry." Jura didn't expect him to be so anxious. "Excuse me, officer. How long will this child go to military training?" The youth said calmly, "The training period is 3 years. In these 3 years, there will be 1 day of vacation every month to come back and reunite with you. However, my suggestion is that you should take advantage of the vacation to have a good rest or supplement your knowledge. Otherwise, it will be very difficult to last for 3 years." Jura's face changed. "So hard? What happens if I'm eliminated?" "Don't worry. Even if I'm eliminated, I can still get a small position," the youth in the standard soft armor said indifferently. Gray was relieved when he heard their dialogue. He turned around and saw Dean, who was still eating slowly. He couldn't help but say, "You are not going to prepare? Don't let the officer wait too long." Dean sighed. He hated being interrupted when he was eating. In the past, he would have lost his temper. Looking at Gray's eyes, he could only put down the food roll, clapped his hands, and went back to his room. He had already folded 2 sets of clothes and put them into the linen backpack. Of course, the most important thing was his super chip. He had already put it into the pocket of one of the clothes. After everything was ready, Dean came to the door and looked up at the youth in the standard soft armor. "Let's go." Jura's eyes were full of reluctance as she said, "Have you put everything on? Clothes, washing cups, it's all packed." Dean waved his hand, indicating that there was no need to worry. "Be careful when you go there. Don't fight with other children. Just bear with them." Dean's heart warmed. Although the last time he was sold to Avril's house, he could see that Jura was still sincere to him. If he wanted to blame someone, he could only blame his feelings. After all, it was an adoptive relationship, so he was very grateful. "I will. You also have to take care of yourself. The temperature is high in the Black Death season. Open the windows to ventilate. Don't get infected." Dean said. Jura was an emotional person. She didn't know when they would meet again. Her eyes couldn't help but burst into tears. "Let's go." The youth in the standard soft armor turned and jumped into the carriage. He didn't help Dean with the backpack. Dean climbed into the carriage and looked at Jura and Gray, who were at the door. He waved his hand. There was a trace of reluctance in his heart, but soon this feeling was suppressed at the bottom of his heart. His hands clenched the backpack, his eyes became cold, and his soft heart became cold and strong. The carriage entered the commercial district. It turned more than a dozen streets and gradually entered a remote street with few people. Not long after moving forward, a huge high wall blocked the carriage. The youth in the soft armor shook the reins, and the carriage moved along the high wall. Not long after, they arrived in front of an open door. This door was locked by a huge iron gate. The door was engraved with 2 warriors holding a sword and a saber respectively, and 2 words were engraved below them: loyalty and protection. "Get off!" the youth in the standard soft armor shouted. Dean jumped out of the carriage and quietly observed the new environment. "Come with me." The youth in the standard soft armor glanced at him and loosened the reins. He was not afraid that the carriage would run away. He led the way and entered through a small door next to the huge iron gate. Behind the gate was a huge drill ground. The youth took Dadian to a remote minaret behind the drill ground. As soon as they came here, they heard a burst of low sobbing. The youth in the standard soft armor frowned and pushed open the wooden door. He saw 7 or 8 children standing in the hall of the minaret. One of them was a little girl with curly hair. She was holding her knees and squatting on the ground crying. The boys next to her were at a loss and embarrassed. The youth in the standard soft armor said coldly, "What's going on?" One of the boys was shocked. He quickly said, "Minnie. Minnie said she is homesick." The youth in the standard soft armor indifferently said, "Really?" He came to the front of the little girl and ordered, "I give you 2 seconds to stop crying and stand up." Chapter 14. Although I am not your instructor, but I hate to see people crying in front of me. The youth said coldly, "After I send you to the dormitory, you can cry as much as you want. Otherwise, you won't have the strength to cry later." The children turned pale and didn't dare to speak. The little girl called Minnie clenched the corner of her clothes, bowed her head, and held back her tears. The youth glanced at the children and was too lazy to reprimand them. He went to the counter, opened a drawer, and grabbed a bunch of keys from inside. He turned around and said, "Follow me." Then he left the hall. Dadian immediately followed. The children also picked up their backpacks from the ground and followed. Along the forest trail, they came to a low, dilapidated wooden shed. The youth came forward and opened a few doors. "This is the place. Go and choose an empty bed. The special training will start tomorrow morning." He threw the key to Dean, who was not far from him, and left. Dean grabbed the 3 keys in his hand and looked at the row of dilapidated wooden sheds. He frowned slightly. It seemed that these sheds were specially built for them to live in. They were completely incomparable to the gorgeous, unique, and sturdy buildings around them. Even in the slums, these sheds were relatively inferior houses. Is this to let us experience suffering? Dadian knew that the special training would not start tomorrow morning, but from this moment, he walked to each of the 3 rooms and took a look. The layout inside was the same. There were 4 beds in each wooden shed. There were no straw mats, and some of the wooden planks were still stained with dark, corrosive substances. He quickly glanced at them and picked a relatively clean wooden plank. He placed his backpack on it and occupied it first. He planned to wait for the others to choose their beds before going out to find some leaves or weeds and wiping the beds. At this time, the other children also came to choose their beds. When they saw the shabby wooden boards inside, they were all dumbfounded. Then, they stopped in front of the room, unable to bear it any longer. Even the boys pursed their lips slightly, feeling wronged. The little girl called Minnie, however, squatted down and cried again. Damn! Dadian knew that he was thinking too much. Most of the children would not step into this room for a while. After all, they grew up in the residential area. They had never seen such a harsh environment. He placed the keys to the other 2 rooms at the door and kept the key to his room in his hand. Then, he went to the forest nearby and quickly picked up some dry fallen leaves and green grass. After returning to his room, he wiped off the black mold on the wooden board. He secretly regretted that if he had known this would happen, he would have brought a mattress and bedding from home. The other children looked at Dean, who was busy here, and stopped their self-pity. After a while, one of the older children bit his teeth and said to the other children, "Let's go and live for a while. It will definitely be better." Despair always needs hope to encourage. The other children saw that someone could adapt and suddenly felt that it was not so unbearable. They silently picked their own beds. The older child chose Dadian's room. He seemed to be curious about Dadian and took the initiative. "My name is Mason. Dadian, you don't seem to be afraid of getting dirty." The child was so direct. "In fact, I have mild mysophobia." Dadian said, "What is mysophobia?" "Nothing." Mason scratched his head. He didn't know what to say. He saw a few moles on the bedboard. He thought of Dadian's previous method and immediately left the room. He pulled some green grass from outside and came back to wipe. But the mold on his bed was too big. No matter how he wiped it, it was still black. He could only find some leaves to cover the mold. Dadian looked at him and said, "In fact, it is much better to use the sun." Mason was surprised and clapped his hands. "Oh, I almost forgot." He immediately called out to the other children and loudly said, "Everyone move the bedboard outside to avoid the inside from rotting." The other children immediately mobilized. Mason looked at Dadian. "Don't you need to sun it? I can't move it." "I'll help you," Mason immediately said. Dean was waiting for these words, although he could speak directly, but he didn't like to open his mouth to ask for help. He said, "Thank you." Then he and Macon moved the bedboard to the open space outside. It didn't take long for another youth wearing a soft armor to come over with a group of children. The youth looked at the open space covered with bedboards. He slightly frowned, but didn't say anything. Just like the previous youth, he randomly opened a few rooms and let the group of children choose their own. He left the keys and left. The group of children curiously looked at Dadian, Macon, and others, and then looked at the bed in their room. One by one, they were stunned. After a while, they also cooperated and moved the bedboard to the open space outside to dry it. "Are the children's residences ready?" Dasha came to the window. She was wearing white silk gloves and holding a metal tube. If Dadian was here, he would recognize that it was an old-fashioned telescope. She slightly opened it and looked at the open space at the end of the woods behind the steeple building. She immediately saw a row of newly built wooden sheds in the open space. "Everything is in accordance with your instructions. This time, the living environment will remain the same. Stop the supply of hot water and bedding." Tobu respectfully said, "I believe that they will soon adapt to the hardship. This time, I am confident that I will bring out 100 scavengers." Dasha nodded slightly. Suddenly, she saw a group of children moving the bedboard in the open space in front of the wooden shed. She couldn't help but be slightly startled. After a while, she put away the telescope and said, "You have to discipline these children well. Now the number of qualified children is decreasing every year. Only by improving the way of teaching can we maintain a stable number of scavengers. In addition, the establishment of guards is close to saturation. It is best to dispel the idea of being eliminated as guards." Tobu bowed his head. "Yes." In the evening, the children worked together and helped each other to move the bedboard back to their respective rooms. Mason opened the backpack and pulled out a quilt from it. He spread it on the bedboard. Immediately, the other two children who chose this room were envious. He was proud of his foresight. He lay down comfortably and chatted with the other two children. Dadian used a change of clothes to pad his body. He closed his eyes and reviewed the knowledge he saw from the super chip in his mind. Unknowingly, he fell asleep. When he woke up again, it was 5 o'clock the next morning. The sky was still dark. Dadian was awakened by a harsh, strange sound. Dadian and the other children got up together. When they came out to look, they saw a bird-like thing that was half the height of a person. It was screaming in front of the wooden shed. The sound was extremely harsh and sharp. It could almost penetrate the eardrum. Chapter 15. The children in each room had just arrived in a new environment, and the place was so dirty and messy that they could barely fall asleep at midnight. At this moment, when they heard the ear-piercing screams, all of them felt as if their heads were being pricked by needles. They walked out of their rooms one after another and looked at the dark sky outside. The temperature in the early hours of the morning was exceptionally cold, and those who were not wearing much could not help but shiver. At this time, the strange bird cried 3 times and stopped. Seeing that it had quietened down, some of the children prepared to go back to sleep. Suddenly, a 2-meter-tall, brown-haired man stepped into the open space in front of the wooden shed and growled, "I'll give you 3 minutes. Gather immediately and stand in front of me." Many of the children were startled, realizing that the special training had begun. Dean's biological clock was destroyed, so he couldn't help but have a headache. He restrained his emotions, turned back to the room, and was ready to add a coat, but after thinking about it, he gave up. He simply washed his face with cold water from the well at the door, and then came to the open space outside the wooden shed. It was only 2.5 minutes since the time given by the strong man. The other children directly gave up on washing up. After putting on their clothes, they gathered early wanted to leave a good impression on this person who seemed to be the instructor. However, there were also some children who were still changing their clothes even after the 3 minutes had passed. Some girls, in particular, held a large pile of clothes in their backpacks and hesitated about which one they should wear today. The brown-haired man did not urge him, but waited quietly. Time passed bit by bit. About 5 minutes later, everyone finally gathered. The brown-haired man looked around at the crowd and calmly said, "Since today is the first day, I will personally wake you up and assemble. From tomorrow onwards, I hope to see everyone standing up when I come here." "Yes," a few brave boys answered loudly. The brown-haired man nodded slightly. "Very good. Today you will be 5 minutes late. Everyone, run 5 laps in the drill ground before coming back." Many of the children's expressions changed slightly. They had seen that huge drill ground. Not to mention 5 laps. Even 1 lap was enough to tire them to death. "Teacher, why is it everyone? We didn't exceed 3 minutes. Even if he's late, he'll only be 2 minutes late. Why is it 5 minutes?" The boys couldn't help but ask. The brown-haired brawny man said indifferently, "First of all, even if all of you gather in 3 minutes according to my rules, you will be 3 minutes late, and you'll have to run 3 laps. Secondly, you are a group. If anyone falls behind, the others have the obligation to bear the responsibility for their companions." "Teacher, I can't accept this. There will always be someone dragging us down." "I'm not convinced either," a few of the boys immediately said angrily. The brown-haired man licked his lips and said, "You're not satisfied?" It wasn't a question at all. As soon as he finished speaking, his leg, which was as strong as an elephant's, kicked the stomach of one of the boys who refused to submit. The heavy force sent the boy flying backward, crashing into the bodies of several other children. All of a sudden, a group of them fell. "You're not convinced either?" The brown-haired brawny man walked to another child who was not convinced. He didn't ask. As soon as he finished speaking, he kicked the boy and sent him flying, crushing 3 or 4 other boys. The brown-haired man snorted coldly and said, "In my place, there is only obedience. Whoever doesn't submit, I'll beat you until you do. To tell you the truth, even if I beat you to death, it won't be a problem." At this point, a cold smile appeared on his face as he continued, "In the past few batches, there were many children like you who were beaten to death by me right where I was standing. It's a pity that you didn't get to see it. I hope that in this batch, there will be less trash to dirty my hands." All the children looked at his ferocious face and said such fierce words. All of them were frightened, and their faces turned pale. Some of the girls were scared to the point that their legs were weak. Tears gushed out, but they didn't dare to cry. The brown-haired brawny man saw that the scene had calmed down and coldly said, "What are you waiting for? If you don't finish in 10 minutes, there will be no breakfast." Speaking of this, he suddenly smiled. "This cannot follow the group system. If you don't finish, then you don't get to eat. I don't want to let individual trash pull down the level of everyone." Hearing these words, many of the strong children were suddenly relieved. Dean sighed and secretly complained in his heart. He didn't need to run to know that he would definitely not be able to finish on time. Soon, under the leadership of the brown-haired brawny man, everyone came to the school ground and began to run. However, the school ground was too big. Even the best of the group of children couldn't finish in 10 minutes. Some were late by 1 or 2 minutes, and some were late by 4 or 5 minutes. All of them lost the opportunity to have breakfast. But Dean's result shocked everyone. Of course, it was not fast, but slow. Even some of the weak girls finished in 20 minutes, but Dean used a full 30 minutes. Finally, he won the last place with an indisputable result. This also made Macon and the other 2 boys, who lived in the same room with him, stunned. They immediately pulled away from Dean, and their faces showed that they didn't know him. Although Dean was relatively calm, but when he saw everyone's strange eyes, he still felt slightly embarrassed. But after calming down, he felt his progress. The sequelae caused by the freezer were slowly weakening with the passage of time. If it was a few months ago, let alone 5 laps in 30 minutes, even if it was a morning, he may not be able to finish running. Just walking was tiring, let alone running. The brown-haired, brawny man glanced at Dean, but didn't say anything. This made Dean somewhat surprised. He thought that he would be killed as an example to others. He brought up a few words of ridicule, but he didn't expect that nothing would happen. Everyone gather. After Dean finished running, the brown-haired brawny man called everyone to gather again. This time, everyone's movements were much more agile, and soon they were neatly arranged. First, let me formally introduce myself. My name is Tobu. The brown-haired brawny man indifferently said, I'm the teacher responsible for training you for the next 3 years. I only have one rule, and that is to obey any of my orders. I don't want to hear any more questions from some idiots. Of course, I don't want the people I teach to be a bunch of puppets who only know how to follow orders. I welcome any questions other than my orders. Teacher, what are we learning here? Is it just exercise? A boy immediately asked, and then looked at him with some apprehension. Tobu indifferently smiled and said, Here, as long as you learn to live, you can graduate. Live? All the children were surprised. Chapter 16. Here, I will teach you how to survive in an environment with nothing. Tobu coldly said, Today is your first day here. I will give you 3 rewards. As long as you answer my questions correctly, you can get the rewards. All the children's eyes lit up. The first question, Tobu calmly said, How can we survive? All the children were stunned. How to survive? They had never thought about this problem. They were sheltered by their parents since childhood. When they reached the age of enrollment, they would choose their favorite college. After graduation, they would join the workforce. This was their life path. Make money. A girl immediately raised her hand and rushed to answer. When the other children heard this, they immediately sighed in frustration. That's right. If you want to survive, of course, you have to learn how to make money. Such a simple answer. Unexpectedly, let others get it first. Tobu's face remained indifferent as he spat out 2 words. Wrong. All the children were stunned. Wrong? Work. Another boy tentatively said. Tobu glanced at him and indifferently said, Wrong. By the way, everyone has only one chance to answer. All the children looked at each other, neither to make money nor to work. Teacher, what do you mean by survive? Under what circumstances do you mean survive? A fair-skinned little girl frowned as she pondered. Tobu looked at her and indifferently said, There is no situation, just live. All the children couldn't help but look at each other. Dean also slightly frowned. His mind was racing. According to his observation, Tobu should not be deliberately mystifying. The previous answer was undoubtedly correct. If he had to define it as wrong, then there was only one answer left. Eat. He raised his hand. As soon as he finished, the children around him looked at him. One by one, they were stunned. Some of the children laughed out loud. Eat? Could your answer be any more idiotic? Correct. Tobu indifferently said. All the children. Looking at the dumbfounded expression of all the children, Tobu coldly smiled. Such a simple answer. Only one person answered correctly. The free reward almost couldn't be sent out. In addition to water, is there feces in your brain? All the children's faces were ugly, but they were somewhat unconvinced. But after witnessing Tobu's previous atrocities, no one dared to question him. Dean was relieved. Originally, his idea was the same as the other children. He thought that it could not be such a simple and idiotic answer. He did not expect to win the bet. The second question. Tobu coldly said, How can I eat food? All the children were stunned. What kind of weird question was this? Make money. A voice quickly replied. It was the little girl who had answered before. This time, she still chose the same answer. The other children immediately wanted to stomp their feet. Damn it, they had missed it before, but this one was snatched away again. Wrong. Tobu said coldly. The little girl stared blankly, not daring to believe her ears. She was wrong again? The other children were also a little startled, but they quickly realized that they still had a chance, and hurriedly raised their hands to answer. I know it's work. I know, ask Mom for it. Use your upper and lower teeth to chew. The last boy thought of Dean's simple answer and immediately said tentatively. Tobu could not help but look at him. There was a trace of sarcasm on his face. What? Can you chew with your buttocks? The boy's face was full of embarrassment, and his face was as red as blood. All wrong, a bunch of garbage, Tobu coldly said. Dean did not think that the answers he wanted to say were all wrong. He could not help but fall into contemplation, recalling his previous way of thinking. The first step to survive was to eat. The first step to eat. Find food. Dean raised his hand again. Tobu faintly looked at him and said, "Correct." All the children were dumbfounded again. So simple, so simple. The last question, Tobu indifferently said. How to find food? All the children could not help but look at Dean. Dean saw the strange eyes of the children. His heart was helpless. This time he really did not know the answer. Seeing that Dean did not answer, the other children bowed their heads to think. After a moment, there were children who raised their hands to answer. The answer was similar to the previous one, especially the little girl who said, "Make money." The third answer was still to make money. It seemed that she was holding the idea of going down the dark road. But the answer was still wrong. Soon, after a round, almost none of the children answered correctly. Tobu looked around and said, "Why, no one knows." Standing near Dean, the children could not help but look at him. They knew that he had not answered yet. Dean felt their eyes and even felt that Tobu was looking at him. It seemed that Tobu was waiting for him to answer. But this time he really did not know. All the answers that he could think of were answered by others. It seems that there is no answer. Tobu saw that Dean did not answer, so he no longer waited. He plainly said, "The first step to find food is to learn to identify food. Today's first lesson is to teach you how to recognize food." Dean finally knew the purpose of the 3 questions. Through yesterday's conversation with Mason, he confirmed his guess. The other children here did not know that they were not special guards training, but scavengers special training. Dudian knew from Fino that scavengers were in the wilderness outside the giant wall to find resources. In that case, they would not carry too many resources, so they must learn how to survive in the wilderness outside the giant wall. Recognizing food was their first lesson. "Teacher, what is my reward?" Dean saw that Tobu did not announce it, so he raised his hand and asked. Tobu looked at him and said, "Each question is rewarded with a breakfast. Congratulations, you got 2 breakfasts as a reward. But today's breakfast time has passed. You have to wait until tomorrow to use it." Just 1 breakfast? Dean was a bit stunned. He did not know that in just half a month of special training, he had deeply realized how precious these 2 breakfasts were. The other children heard that the reward was just breakfast, so they immediately felt psychological balance. "Now, the break is over. Run 10 laps of the drill ground," Tobu suddenly shouted. All the children could not help but be stunned. They had just finished running, and now they were going to run again? The time is half an hour. Every 5 minutes, you will add 1 lap. Tobu indifferently announced the rules. "Teacher, don't run again. I'm going to vomit." Some children could not help but wail, but soon they saw the image of the leading role model being kicked away, so they ran at full speed. Dean's mouth slightly twitched. The rules were ruthless to him, but he faintly guessed that Tobu was exercising their endurance. After all, according to Tobu, since they were learning how to survive, then the exercise was not strength and fighting, but speed and durability. Chapter 17. Time flies. 3 months passed in the blink of an eye. In the past 3 months, in addition to the daily long-distance running endurance training, there was this survival education course. This was a general term. Obviously, after a long time of testing, it was mainly divided into 2 major categories: foraging and collecting resources. This was the basic ability that scavengers must master. Foraging was subdivided into several courses, namely water source, shelter, getting food, and survival. Every course contained a wide range of content. The first was the water source course, which talked about finding water sources in different environments. These environments are divided into 4 main categories: jungles, deserts, mountains, and swamps. Finding water in the jungle was the simplest, but the jungle was prone to lurking dangers. How to avoid these dangers was taught in the survival course. In addition to finding water sources, there was also water filtration and different water quality testing, and so on. Obviously, scavengers not only had to survive outside the giant wall, but also needed to collect water samples from different places and bring them back to the giant wall for research. The entire giant wall of Sylvia was a huge and solid shelter. In addition to foraging, collecting resources was also subdivided into 4 major courses. The knowledge was extremely huge, namely mining, gathering herbs, geological survey, and exploration. In the outside world, every single one of them was a specialized course for a single school to specialize in. In other words, any of these courses in the outside school would take 3 years of study. Only the smart and diligent could graduate. But here, it was necessary to learn all of them in just 3 years. Only by mastering all of them could he meet the requirements of Tobu and live. For Dudian, the most difficult thing in these 3 months was not the 8 courses, but the endurance training and the physical training of the mining course. Every time was as hard as death. However, his progress in these 3 months was extremely obvious. From the first day, he was able to run 5 laps in 30 minutes. A week later, he was able to run 5 laps in 20 minutes. Half a month later, he was able to run 5 laps in 15 minutes. It was not until a month later that he got the right to eat breakfast. He was still the last of the last children. The first 2 chances to eat breakfast were used on the second day and in the middle of the month, helping him survive. The continuous acceleration of his speed was not only because the sequela of the freezer was gradually disappearing, but also because of his own willpower, which allowed him to persist in the state of exhaustion again and again until he almost fainted. In the second month, the sequelae of the cryogenic chamber were completely eliminated. Normally, it would take another 3 to 4 months for the sequelae to be completely eliminated. However, this month of ultra-intense training had accelerated the process. After the sequelae of the cryogenic chamber were completely eliminated, his speed immediately increased. In his daily endurance training, he was able to steadily enter the top 10. By the 3rd month, he was already in the top 3. This amazing progress made other children look at him with admiration, especially Macon and the other 2 children who lived in the same room as Dudian. They gave him a nickname, Mad Cow. Law. Chapter 2. Normative Role of the Law. Dudian was standing in front of the law bookshelf in the quiet library. He was holding an introductory law book in his hand. Since the beginning of the 3rd month, he would spend 10 minutes a day in the library to study the law. This was the longest time he could squeeze out. Dean, why are you reading the law again? The teacher told us that there will be an exam today. He told us to review it. If we fail, we will be eliminated. Macon, who was in front of a geological bookshelf, looked at Dudian, who was in front of the law bookshelf. He was speechless. Dudian made a gesture. Shoo. He continued to concentrate on reading the basic law book in his hand. Soon, 10 minutes passed. Although he had only read half of the book, he still closed the book and put it back. He turned back to the bookshelf and skillfully pulled out a book called Plants Encyclopedia. He quickly reviewed it and confirmed that he had not missed anything. He put it back into the bookshelf and turned to leave. Dean, Macon quickly caught up with him. What do you think will be tested in today's exam? I don't know. Dudian answered truthfully. I hope it won't be a test of geological survey. I haven't had time to learn this subject. Macon's eyes turned as he smiled. How about this? If I come across something I know, I will help you. If it is something you know, you will help me. How about it? Dudian said, Don't think about cheating with this trick of ours. Let's try it secretly. Macon bitterly said, I don't want to be eliminated. The teacher said that the eliminated will lose the qualification to be a guard. Moreover, I have to pay for the special training. My family can't afford such a high cost. Dudian shrugged his shoulders, indicating that he was powerless. Indeed, on the 3rd day of the special training, Tobu had said these words. But Dudian had long known that this training was nominally to select guards. But in fact, it was to train scavengers. Most of the eliminated people would become guards. Tobu's words were tantamount to revealing the truth and confirming Dudian's guess. Of course, for other children, this was undoubtedly bad news. It was these words that made many children who had long wanted to give up clench their teeth and persevered. Soon, the two arrived at the drill ground before the stipulated time. There were already a lot of people gathered here. They were whispering and seemed to be guessing what the exam topic would be. It didn't take long for Tobu to appear on time. Before he appeared, everyone was standing neatly and meticulously. Of course, many people had learned this from the pain of being kicked in the abdomen. However, this time Tobu didn't appear alone. He was accompanied by a slim and tall, graceful figure. She was a girl in her early 20s. She had a wheat-colored complexion, and her face was no longer childish. Instead, it was filled with a mature and sexy charm. She didn't lose the youthful aura of her age. She had a shallow smile on her face, which made many children in their teens slightly open their mouths. In reality, the phenomenon of early maturity wasn't something that only existed in this world. Even in the olden era, children who were around 10 years old knew far more about certain aspects than adults. In this world, 13 years old was the legal age for marriage. If one still hadn't gotten married at 20 years old, they would already be at the age where they hated marriage. After all, under the corrosion of radiation, it was not easy for most people to live to 60 years old. Feeling the impatience in the eyes of some older children, Tobu sneered and said in his usual low tone, "In these 3 months of training, you garbage have barely qualified to be the basic guards. From today on, every 6 months, there will be a big exam. If you fail, you will be eliminated." All the children's faces showed a hint of tension. Chapter 18. Survive for 10 days? All the children were startled. Although Tobu said it was simple, but after 3 months of getting along with him, everyone already knew what he meant by simple. No one expected that this assessment was not the kind of test they had in mind, but a hands-on test. Obviously, if they wanted to survive for 10 days, they must master all 4 courses of foraging. Soon, some people began to calculate. As long as there was a water source, the limit of fasting was 7 to 15 days. If the willpower was extremely tenacious, it was possible to survive for a month. In other words, as long as they found a way to find a water source, there was hope to pass. If they were lucky enough to find a little food, it would not be a problem to survive for 10 days. Thinking of this, many children's confidence was greatly increased. Dean slightly frowned. His heart was not too optimistic. With Tobu's style, he would never give such a simple test. "Children, come with me." At this time, standing next to Tobu, the woman named Chris said with a smile, "Sister will take you to a fun place. I guarantee that you will like it." Some of the older boys heard her words, and their eyes burst into light. "Line up." Chris smiled and turned to lead the way. All the children lined up side by side in a long line. Under the leadership of Chris, they soon came to the school field. There were dozens of black carriages parked here. Each carriage was the same as the one that brought Dean here. The carriages could accommodate 7 or 8 adults. If it was children, it was more than enough to sit 10. "Get in the carriage." Chris grinned. The coachmen of these carriages were young men wearing standard soft armor. One of them was the one who brought Dean here. "Dean, come here." Macon called Dean in front of carriage. Dean glanced at it and walked over. In addition to Macon, there were 2 other children who lived in the same room with him. Apparently, Macon had called them together, ready to take care of each other in the next test. After all, the people in the same room were the most trustworthy. "Hey, the curtains here are sewn." Macon was ready to lift the curtain to look out, but immediately noticed it. Dean's heart suddenly had a bad feeling. Was the test venue outside the giant wall? Dean closed his eyes, silently listening and calculating. It had been 20 minutes since they left the school grounds. At first, he could hear some passers-by talking outside the carriage. Later, the noise outside gradually quieted down. It was obvious that the carriage had entered a remote place. It was silent all the way. The silence lasted for half an hour before the carriage gradually slowed down. After completely stopping, Dean slowly opened his eyes. There was a glimmer of light in his eyes. 28 turns and 3 short stops in the middle. It should be a check. The route should be to the west. In his mind, he repeatedly recalled the route that he had sensed earlier. The carriage was moving very fast, so it was very obvious when it made a turn. He could also sense whether it was a left or a right turn. If Chris knew what was going on in Dudian's mind, she would be stunned. Although it was not difficult to do this, as other children could do it as long as they paid attention. However, from the moment they entered the carriage, the psychological oppression caused by the dark, enclosed environment and the pressure brought by the first test made all the children's hearts full of worries. How could they have the mind to calm down and pay attention to these things? This was absolutely cruel and terrible calmness. The most important thing was that this calmness appeared in a child's body. The carriage was pulled open. Dudian knew that this time it was not an inspection, but the final destination. All the children quickly came down from the carriages and eagerly looked at the place where they were going to live for 10 days. The next moment, all the children were stunned. In front of them was unexpectedly a desert. Yes, there was only sand in the desert. Survive in the desert for 10 days. All the children wanted to spurt blood. Dudian jumped from the carriage and saw the endless hot desert. He could not help but sigh. Sure enough, Tobu said that it was simple, but it could never be so simple. Children. Chris clapped her hands to attract the attention of all the children. There was a charming smile on her face. Next, you will survive here. If you can't hold on, just draw an X sign on the ground and you will be rescued. Of course, at the same time, it means elimination. It also means that your family has to bear the cost of special training during this period. I believe that you are probably aware of the cost. If you don't want your family to go bankrupt, then you have to work hard. At this point, she blinked and said, I wish you all good luck. By the way, the first test is the easiest. Then he turned around and jumped on a nearly 3 meters high black horse. This black horse had pure hair. It was the same breed of horse that Dudian had seen before to pull the hunter's carriage. Obviously, this also represented the identity of Chris. It was likely that she was a hunter. Dean narrowed his eyes and quietly watched as Chris whipped her horse and rode away. The rest of the carriages also turned around and galloped away, raising sand and dust as they gradually disappeared from the sight of all the children. For a time, there were only more than 300 children left in the vast desert. How can we survive? This is murder. I knew it would not be so simple. After Chris and others left with the carriages, the children immediately shouted angrily. Everyone! Everyone! A tall and strong child in the crowd shouted, We have to unite and find water. As long as we find water, we can survive. Unity is strength. Obviously, this child adapted very quickly. When the other children heard his words, they no longer complained. Some responded to his words, while others began to think about how to survive in the next 10 days. In the previous 3 months of special training, everyone had learned not to reason with Tobu, because you use your mouth while the other side uses his fists. Dean, let's go with them. Macon said to Dudian. Since the first day, he gradually got used to asking for Dudian's opinion. In their room, although he had the most appeal, but the most prestige was undoubtedly Dudian. No, the 4 of us will be fine. Dudian shook his head. Macon was stunned. Why? The other 2 children were also puzzled. Unity is strength. This was an absolute truth. Moreover, the content of the curriculum was, in a harsh environment, unity is the only way to survive. However, Dudian's prestige had been established in the past 3 months, so they did not immediately question him. It is easy to find water if there are many people, but this is a desert, not a jungle or a swamp. Water is scarce here. Even if we find it, we can only meet the needs of some people. Eventually, it will inevitably disintegrate because of the uneven distribution of resources. Dudian said directly. Macon and the other 2 children were startled, but immediately woke up. Let's go. We have wasted a lot of time. Dudian looked around, found a direction, and took the lead. You're tuning into the warrior lore YouTube channel. Don't forget to subscribe and join us on this journey to catch the most captivating stories.